just like a cantilever. It's like, you know, you put one book on and you can reach out a bit further with another concept and then another concept. And I think Foucault, the philosopher, indulged in a lot of this. And I had to chop it, and I thought I have to think more concretely. And it's an advantage, but it also limits you if you prevent yourself from going off into flights of fancy.
Well, wait a minute. You're going against Archimedes. You go out on the lever and you can lift the world. I mean, what's wrong with you?
Is that what he said?
That's right.
Did it work?
I don't know. I mean, I'm going to go argue against Archimedes.
Well, it's the struggle between concrete and what they term abstract thought. And you can indulge in all sorts of abstractions.
Well, you're right that the Romans did have concrete. That you're absolutely right. But it was the Romans that killed them.
Yeah, well, I think the story's been aired here that the Romans viewed philosophy as being some impractical
Yeah.
behaviour.
Yeah, I guess so. Between
You
philosophy,
only indulged in it in absolute necessity.
well, I guess, they're right between philosophy and concrete. I mean, concrete wins. Look at all the buildings that are still alive.
How you guys doing today?
Hey, good to see you.
What?
Good to see all of you. Where is everybody? They haven't come yet. There's five. Yeah.
Maybe they believe the advertisement for the time.
Yeah.
So we had a little bit of a glitch. It advanced at 24 hours ahead.
Yeah.
Well, Rick always knows the correct time because he is the clock. You know?
Well,
that's a hell of an aspiration.
If the human mind works like Windows, would be in a heck of a lot of trouble.
well, yesterday I was at a meeting about time, which is interesting. And and I came in a little early, and the host was there. I said, "Well, did you schedule this exactly at the switch at the daylight saving time just to confuse everybody?" And she said, I thought of that. She came up with the idea when she was swimming, and somebody said, daylight savings time is, standard time is coming up. And she said, "Oh, that's a good time to hold a meeting on time." So she did it on purpose.
So did they make the Twilight Zone?
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting discussion, actually.
I would say one thing, I think, with a lot of these modern computer programs that I just say, I just get the feeling that there's not much imagination really going on anymore. Like 30 years ago, I think there was a much greater effort being made. And today they're just cruising on what was done before and adding a few bits of tinsel to it, so to speak.
Well, I think part of the way to understand it is that software engineering in the earlier days was anything goes because no one knew what you could or couldn't do with it. But these days, it's become such a business that many of the companies we think of as software production companies are actually software non-production companies. They make their money by charging as much as possible and then actually doing as little with that for that money as they can. So to have programmers program is to waste potential profits. The less you touch the software, the more money you make. And so as a result, there's this huge momentum in software where you're not really allowed to change anything significant. The side effect of that is that people spend much less time each week immersed in the software, which means they understand it less well than they used to. I've got some software that I'm the principal author for that's used around the world in medical software, and it's I know that module better than anyone on earth. I mean, I rewrote it 12 times so far in my life. And yet, I don't know it today nearly as well as I knew it 10 years ago because I'm not actually in the software as much. I'm elsewhere. And it doesn't take long before the details about the architecture that make it work together begin to fade from your brain. It's like anything else. If you don't do it all the time, your proficiency lapses. So, this whole profit structure where we say the less programmers work, the more money we make, means that you're getting increasingly less qualified programmers and designers because they just aren't given the opportunities to immerse themselves that they used to have.
It's
Rick,
a bit like
Rick, you're a philosopher, and you're just bitter about the fact that most people just want to coast in life. Like including philosophy. The whole thing about metaphysics is to like latch onto some computation and just coast. Like, oh, I don't have to do any answers. Like 2 + 2 is 4. It's done for me. Like, yeah.
So Phil, you know what happens to people like that? When you die, you go up before the tribunal, and they say you have to justify your future existence. Now we observe that you just took it easy and coasted in your last life.
Well, what's wrong with coasting?
Well, Rick has something in philosophy. I mean, in software, is that an awful lot is just tinkering with what they call the user experience, the interface, that what the program ever does. I mean, haven't you noticed that, say, Windows hasn't changed much since Windows 7, except for the user interface? That Microsoft keeps redoing it, making the same stuff unfamiliar to people over and over again. But the internals are largely the same. I saw an excellent interview with Dave Cutler, the architect of Windows NT, came from Digital Equipment, and quite a sharp software. And they asked him, well, how much of Windows is what you did in the original Windows NT? And he says, well, all the critical stuff in the kernel is exactly the same. And because it all worked and was done right, and there's no need to ever change it.
Yeah, Digital was different from Microsoft.
Well, they were an engineering company. It was engineers producing computer equipment for our process and control engineers largely. So it had quite a the idea is things would have really long lifetimes, not a churn for revenue.
That's right.
Hey, Donald, when you were talking, I was just thinking how much of a Platonist you are. Like, the forms remain, the appearance continually change.
Well,
you just uncover yourself as a Platonist.
And he's exposing the market as Platonic.
Well, but yeah, the software I worked on, we had that problem. In not me personally, but we produced ground stations for geosynchronous satellites. And those things had, a 15, 20-year lifespan. The ground station go forever, and trying to find an operating system with support for a product that would remain in service for 2 decades. Where do you find that? And literally, we had some stuff. I wasn't on the development, but I worked on the maintenance. They picked Windows XP. Oh, it all had to become Linux eventually. So that we could, in a sense, have our own version with perpetual support. Now that's a big thing, but when you try to have things, even people that say, well, we do enterprise software. We'll do sort of 5-year type thing. But that's not long enough for the embedded control business.
No.
You know.
No.
You know.
Yeah,
I can just imagine in a hospital that somebody comes in and says, well, you know, we've got to update the OS on your MRI machine. And they go, what?
Don't you touch it. Don't you touch that thing.
No.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, with medical software, the question is, at what age in your life would you like the software to stop working and start letting people accidentally prescribe you things you're allergic to that are going to kill you? What's the point? You know, how many decades into your life is the point at which you would like to die from medical errors caused by bad software? And if the answer is, well, I'd prefer not ever to have that happen, then you're talking about software that has to work for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. You're not talking about software that you can just be swapping out every year or two, every 5 years as the fads take the market.
Well,
we loved DEC. I mean, I was so angry when the digital management went stupid and parted the company out, because we loved people engineering things that would last for decades, because that's what you need as your platform for medical software.
What I did was demanding in terms of quality, but we never approached medical quality. And we knew that, that was just somewhere. Nobody could die if our software failed. And we were quite aware. No, I mean, it's a big deal. People, the guys that do like automotive software, they have the same thing. Or for a while when I was at Honeywell, there was a group that did avionics software. You can't have airplanes falling out of the sky or stuff. And so I like to work on control type applications and stuff, but there are really demanding fields in there that have just crazy requirements.
Yeah.
And meeting them.
I could see you guys are anti-capitalist, man. If everybody was like you, our economy will fall apart. What the hell is wrong with you?
See, to clarify, we, in medical informatics, those of us who are serious about it, we love competition. We want to see people competing for who can make the most stable, most solid, most bulletproof systems. In 1982, when the VA was selecting what it would use for its computers, they would set up these massive database updates and then go behind the computer and unplug it in the middle of the update. And then wait a minute and then plug it back in and see if there was database corruption. And I said, any computer system that when it fails corrupts the database will kill patients. So we don't want that. So they did, competition can be very healthy, but what you have to do is avoid perverse incentives. Like you can't let the vendors be in charge of the selection. It has to be that they're competing for access through the tests. The moment you get perverse incentives, that's when people start to die, basically.
Are you telling me that plant obsolescence is a perverse incent?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the one of the other things is that, with a computer system that's certified in some way, and even for our applications, it would often take weeks to run the certification test cycle. And technically, anytime you change anything, you have invalidated its certification.
Go back to the beginning.
And management looks at that and says, well, that's an unnecessary cost.
That sounds expensive. Let's just cut that part out. Now we're really making a profit.
I mean, it is. I mean, engineering reacts to that by trying to modularize components of a system so that you can separate parts out, but
to limit the damage.
Yeah, the impact analysis shows little or limits the impact, but still, you know, and then you'll have somebody, well, you know, how come it can't be like my iPhone? Well, let me tell you the ways.
What happens if your iPhone fails versus what happens if your satellite control system fails? Are those really on a par, you think? Consequences?
Right.
Anybody?
You've just spent $1 billion to build a satellite, several hundred million to get it into orbit, and it's taken a decade to do this. And then, yeah, you want
I
to.
remember a criticism of Marlowe's Faust, and that is that Marlowe's version of Faust, which was a more traditional, he gets all this power,
Yes.
but at the end of the day, for selling his soul, quite a steep price, and at the end of the day, all he does is a load of cheap tricks for the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. You've got all that power.
Yes.
And you're playing silly games.
Can't think of anything.
That is humanity in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to be ironic at this particular point, but Donald, you said something important. Modularization really is an important factor because you replace parts, right? And so you could always update things that are a failure in one sense without having to redo the whole thing. So that's actually a good thing, in my opinion.
It is, but what Donald and I will both reiterate is that modularization helps but doesn't solve the problem.
Well, yeah.
Because you've got the interactions among the modules then. And so my module fails. Well, how many other modules depend on this module? And so now they fail. You get these cascade ripple effects. But anyway, you know, it's one of those things where you can work in software your whole life, and as long as the things you were doing were just video games, you never learn the full suite of lessons available to be learned out of software engineering. But the more you work in the kind of stuff that Donald does, or you know, avionics, you begin to get to what the real lessons are, and it sort of forces you to become a philosopher, because you have to come to grips with the horrible situation you're put in where you're being managed by your inferiors. You know, the people who are in charge of you haven't been doing it as long. They don't understand the problem as well as you, but they're smart. They've had experiences elsewhere, and they're filled with confidence. And so they drive the organization with great determination straight off a cliff, you know, because they know there's no cliff there, and they can't believe you when you tell them, because look how rich they are, look how successful they've been, look how many awards they've won. They can't possibly be as stupid in this new area as somebody who was a newcomer.
Are you knocking the Tyrannosaurus, are you?
I'm going right back to Nietzsche, Stephen. You know, I'm always going to go right back to Nietzsche. You know, power makes stupid, but it's not just power. Success makes stupid, because we start to think that our success is a personal attribute, and that now we can go to some new unrelated field and we'll be successful there too. We don't understand the enormous amount of damage we can do. You know, in many ways, I would rather have a beginner who knew he was a beginner managing us than somebody who had decades of experience but in the wrong fields, who was determined not to listen to anybody because he was so sure of himself. You know, that the destructive power of ego it can't be underestimated.
Well, thank you for complimenting me for being a failure.
Was I doing that? I didn't think I was doing that. I didn't think I was doing that. Anyway, you know, I think about the stuff we talk about on these philosophy seminars many times a week while I'm working in medical software. It's all directly relevant. You know, it's we you know, we've had discussions about what's the pragmatic value of you know, the use value of philosophy. And as David has pointed out, you know, Kenneth Smith hates that question. He'll respond like Donald says and say, well, it's just useless, and he'll do that to be provocative. But what he really means, the longer answer that he gives at other times, is that he has a thing where he says it like this: the fool thinks that a little folly is harmless and figures that he won't waste his time trying to be wise until he's on his deathbed. And then at the very end, he'll confront the ultimate things and try to set himself up to go to heaven. Now I've been forgiven. Now I'm a good person. I get it. And he thinks by doing that he's saved himself from having to pay for the difficulties of philosophy. But Kenneth says, but what he doesn't understand is he's paying for his folly every single day and every decision he makes for being non-philosophical. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know why he's doing the things he does. And as a result, he can't estimate right and wrong, good and evil, the consequences of his actions. It's all oblivious to him, and as a result, he'll never understand how much he paid for his foolishness, thinking to save himself.
David sent me a meme, that 70s show, and the girl says, well, I've decided to major in philosophy. And the guy says, oh, that's good. They're building a philosophy factory in Green Bay.
Yes. 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 This is the modern perspective on philosophy.
If there's a story, it goes back to, I think, the British mathematician G.H. Hardy, the algebraist, number theory, where he was asked, what's the value of mathematics? And he says, none, it's useless. He says, at least it's useless to mathematicians. Math might be quite useful to scientists or engineers, but I just sit and contemplate its beauty.
G.H. Hardy, that's a good one. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just put the reference to it in the chat. Yeah. All right, well, let's go to the text. So you'll notice we're still in the same sentence. We have one last thing to unpack, and I went over it again before today's session, and it's that last phrase. The mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic, the psychological. And of course, you're going to see why I'm going to unpack this like crazy, because what do we have here? We have mythos, we have logos, and we have psyche. Three incredibly loaded terms, to the classical Greeks. And we can read a sentence like this. We might disagree with it, or we might agree with it, but we're going to read it as a modern. The mythic mind, that would be a mind full of errors and flaws, right? They subscribe to myths. The logic of the psychic. Well, we're going to think logic, well, like that would be like propositions and derivations, conclusions, and the psychic. We think at first it's woo, right? Oh, they're talking about woo, psychic phenomena, and then we'll go, oh no, oh I see. They're just using the fancy woo term for the brain. So this is about the equations that describe the brain. This is how we're going to read this. We're going to see Freud and Jung and others in this. And psychological, of course, that's head shrinkers, right? Those are the people that you pay money to so that they can get your head on straight so you can go back to producing money for people. That's what psychology is. It's how to not be sick so that you don't lose your ability to pay your rent. That's the purpose of psychology. So from a modern perspective, we've got all these definitions underpinning this thing. But this I'm going to call it a sentence, this little clause here at the end, the mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic, is in some sense his entire thesis for chapter 4 in one sentence. And it carries that mind if you read the words mythos, logos, and psyche the way that the ancients did, which he's trying to unpack for us, lettered section by lettered section, until finally we at least gain the choice of being able to read this sentence the way that he meant it, and not the way that a modern would normally interpret it. So looking at that, the first thing to know here is logos, right? He's not talking about the logos of logos culture. That's a lowercase l logos. He's not talking about the logos of John or Genesis. He's talking about the logos of Heraclitus. right? This is all Heraclitean. And the logos of Heraclitus isn't just a little bit different from those other things. It's the opposite of those other things. It's as far away as you can get from them. It's this premise that Heraclitus has scattered among his fragments. If you put them together, the premise emerges over time, which is that to be immortal is not just to die, but it's also that your creative works fail and that you're just astonishingly stupid. All of us are astonishingly stupid. And we're not stupid in the sense that, you know, it's an insult and haha, he made us feel bad. We're astonishingly stupid in that we are thrown into a situation that demands powers we don't have. Mm-hmm. We're in an infinite cosmos with a finite brain. We're just hopelessly outmatched in trying to do justice to the rights of the question, to use Socrates' phrase. You know, every question that comes up in our life, every situation we run into, we have a tiny fragments of the faculties we ought to have available to us if we were to genuinely do the right thing in every situation. So how far from right are we about this? Well, to a modern, we're close enough. In fact, maybe better than close enough. The best of all possible brains. This is Homo sapiens. What an adorable creature. But to Heraclitus, he says the core problem is this. In us, in the working of our mind, we have this limited finite intelligence. And because of its finitude, it grasps only fragments of what's happening around it. And there are so many possible things it should be grasping that for any given person, the selection of fragments that they're paying attention to is idiosyncratic, right? What Donald sees in the world and what Phil and Sharon and Steven sees in the world, what I see in the world, we all see different collections of fragments. We're like magpies who've gone to different places in the world and collected different bits. And we're trying to interpret the world through those different bits that we have. So Heraclitus says the problem is that ultimately we may use a shared language, seemingly communicating with each other, but what's actually occurring in our brains is different from each other, not because we each have our own perspective in some glorious modern way, but because each of us is missing different tools that are required to understand what's happening. Each of us misinterprets in our own characteristic ways. And the result, says Heraclitus, is as though we are all asleep and sleepwalking through life, and each having our own private dream while thinking that we're all awake and sharing some kind of common situation. But ultimately, we're disconnected from each other by our private intelligences. We're not just disconnected from the world, we're disconnected from each other. And that creates every kind of problem, because Homo sapiens is an animal that thrives on culture. We're not as fast as the cheetah, but we can form cultures. But the problem is, how do you form a culture when you're all working in opposite directions and you all have different pieces of the puzzle, but each of you thinks that you all see the same thing and that you're talking about the same problem? How do you reconcile this tendency to fly apart enough in order to pull together into something healthy? And what Heraclitus argues is that we have to learn. He has a fragment where he just says this. What we need to do is turn away from, to give up our loyalty to the private intelligence that each of us possesses, and instead to turn towards the shared intelligence that we have in common. And that shared intelligence is the intelligence that underlies nature. And he's not talking about God. He's talking about nature itself makes sense. It works, right? I mean, it produces this abundance. You know, whenever we're not suppressing it, you know, like the first year of the pandemic, everybody stays home, and next thing you know, whales are swimming up the Potomac. You know, I mean, you know, nature will rebound and creates, given its opportunity to do so. It has a logic in the form of what he just calls it an intelligence. He wasn't in a position to know what we know now, which is that the intelligence is the result of trial and error over billions of years. He did have a sense that the world had always existed, that the depths of time were effectively infinite compared to a human lifetime, but he didn't fully understand the consequences of that. But his argument still works within an evolutionary framework, which is through trial and error, the world of nature on the planet Earth has had opportunities to weed out things that definitely don't work and to sort of move in the direction of things that do work. And if we study nature.
Excuse me, is that just the light elves, or does that include the dark elves?
I don't think Heraclitus would exclude the dark elves.
Okay. That means not everything's going to be easy.
Oh, yeah. He talks about conflict, right? He talks about difficulty and strife. Yeah, pain. All of that's involved in it. But the idea is that if you study nature, it will teach you that there's no easy road to getting where we need to go. We have to be willing to struggle. It's, you know, a lot of the things that became the basis of wisdom literature that told us, you know, how we should interact with each other, what we should be willing to demand of ourselves, and so forth. It's there to be found in nature, says Heraclitus, but only if you look below the surfaces of things and look at the arche underneath. That is, you study the logos, the character of nature, and you discover its inherent intelligence. So it means that whenever you're bringing up the logos, you're also bringing up nature, you're bringing up character, you're bringing up arche, you're bringing up this structure in which a hidden harmony exists that generates the visible harmony. So when he says the logic of the psychic, that is the logos of the psyche, he's saying that there is a nature within us, a logos within us, arche within us, a character within us that generates our mind. What we take to be our mind and ourself is generated from this deeper intelligence inside of us. And that deeper intelligence isn't about our conscious choices or what we think of as mathematics or logic or what have you. It's what's underneath it, the deeper thing that generates those things. All of this is present in this statement. Phil and then Stephen, I'll break here. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I like what is being said, but it seems like on the one hand, it sounds quite a lot like Hegel. But there's a main difference. Hegel was still focused on the development of culture and civilization. Not enough attention is placed to nature in that relationship. As a matter of fact, it almost seems to exclude nature, like the whole project, and I think that has something to do with the technical mind, has reigned so supreme over nature that it's become more and more the triumph of civilization over nature. And part of that is because I think, you know, I think the spreading out of the one to the many, a kind of deference, you know, as I mentioned with Derrida, deference to others creates a kind of a good groupthink. Sometimes a groupthink is not a good thing, but a good groupthink, because what it does is when you reflect on each, in fact, human beings depend on that, because I think your identity to a certain degree is authenticated by others. Say, oh yeah, you're that way. If you were just like by yourself, you don't have a reflection, a mirror to look at yourself in a sense, to see who you are. So I think that's an important part, but I think the exclusion of nature is a tremendous thing. And I think part of the thing is that it has something to do with, I think, metaphysical thinking, or a kind of logical thinking, in the sense that, you know, like, we got it. we got it. You know, like nature is always making mistakes. We got it. And, you know, like, and when you look at it, in some sense, we have gotten it in some sense, because if 90% of the mammalian vertebrates are domesticated now, we have herd nature into the city, so to speak. And so in some sense, yeah, that's true. But the thing that I think was missed is because it doesn't understand the ecology of nature. It sort of understands the ecology of civilization. You know, like things interact and they produce, like, you know, the what is it, the psyche, I mean the spirit, the what is, okay, what the spirit versus the you know, the group spirit. And it's like, so there it is that, but it's only now that we're beginning, you know, probably in the last maybe 30 years, we begin to understand that, you know, like, the essence is not in the singularity, but in the complex relationship of many, many things in relationship. And so if nature doesn't so much think in that term, but they do interact in a way that creates a totality that's much more complex and interactive than just like a singularity. Like, same thing with civilization, you know. You yourself, you know, you don't have a civilization if you're not interacting as a culture. So I think that's part of the problem. And I think, in a sense, you know, like Derrida has that difference. There's a deferral, at least into the future, but I'm not sure the deferral is also into nature itself. So I think that's part of the real problem, is that we're still focused on ourselves in a sense. And that might be the tragedy of words in a funny way, you know, because in some sense, the words, on one level, at least in terms of civilization, is all we got, in a sense. I had this discussion in another meeting, and I said, you know, like, and I asked the question about judgment. I said, should judgment be elevated over reason? Because judgment, you know, and I'm displacing Artemis to a certain degree, judgment is at the site of witnessing the thing. And I said, you know, if you think of judgment as like the one that carries the words, that would be Hermes. Hermes was at the site, and he was a messenger, and when he takes the message back to the council of the gods, and he's mounted, he has a lot of influence over what the council going to decide, because depending on his judgment, he's going to decide what was important to report and not report, right? So Hermes is really decisive because Hermes carries the word. And I don't know whether that's the problem, you know, but in some sense, that was very important in relationship to what it is, because we have to translate what actually happened at the site in the words that people understand. And I think that might be one of the cogs that, in some sense, and I think that's why, you know, like poetry is better, because it retains some ambiguity in it. So it's not like, oh, this is what it was. This is what I witnessed, you know, like, now I'm reporting to you, you make a decision, you know, as if the council is a court. And you know, if you don't bring the court the right information, in their collective wisdom, they can't make the right choice. Yes. So I think that there's a whole dynamic there that talks about the ecology of civilization, but it does seem to fence out nature, except as a resource. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's something here about, you know, the role and capacities of Hermes are a blessing if they're infinite, but they become a curse if they're finite, because then it all becomes about what did we not know that we should have known, you know, what was not communicated to us. And
well, it was interesting because when I was saying that, this guy said, you know, like Hermes, that was the origin of the word hermeneutics, right? So you have to be very careful interpreting those words, yes, because like you could unfold many more things as hidden within the words themselves. So hermeneutics is a very, very important part of human understanding, at least.
That's right. Thanks, Phil. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, now we're at this turning point, the axial age, and this is what we've been discussing. Not our modern. I think there was a claim somebody said called the Renaissance the second axial age, but we're talking about what some people term the first one. This transition from the mythic culture to our rational, dry, more prosaic way of viewing the world. And in this ancient culture, which has become very obscure to us, we look at places like ancient Egypt, which, according to legend, had things like the temple sleep. You know, if you had a psychological problem, they had some sort of a practice within the Egyptian temples to somehow correct that, some sort of sleep. And whether it was the same thing or something different, there was a case in some form of initiation, they put people into a death-like trance. Whether they were using chemicals, whether they were using poisons, whether they were using drugs, I don't know. But apparently, like these ancient Egyptian priests had a mastery of this process, which we don't really possess today. The modern mind would just do a botched job. Instead, the world transitions within a few centuries to a mercantile world. You know, you had the Hebrews with their monotheistic God. And I thought about this monotheistic God, that it's like the KFC of gods. You go to one city, you got KFC, you know what religion you're dealing with. You go to another city, meet a fellow merchant, you've got the same religion with all the same details. So, yeah, just once a week, go to the synagogue and we bow our heads, and I'm together with these other businessmen. I've gone all this way, and we're on the same page. So convenient for mercantile activities is to be on the same page throughout all these different cultures. So, you know, they invent money around now. This just makes it so easy. And somehow this rational mercantile culture becomes the value. Like today, even today, they're talking about, just more production, more goods, which eventually become junk you throw out in the hard waste in a few years. And people would love their new stuff. You're sitting, you know, in a hard waste chair. And you go, well, it works. It's good for the environment. People still sneer down their nose at you. This is the world we're living in. So there's been this huge transition. But going back there, what was in those ancient Egyptian temples? How did they develop an art? They didn't know our arts, you know, playing with computers, but they knew the psyche. What's the secret there? What were they working at? Today, we're working at a mercantile civilization of some variety. And what was their culture? They did have a mercantile civilization. They did love gold. They loved jewels. They loved spices. The pharaoh loved all those things. But there was something more that they were valuing that was mythological, which we don't quite understand anymore. Thank you.
A quick question, Rick. I'm sorry, but is this meeting starting an hour later than usual, or something?
No, we started at 11 Pacific
11
time.
your time, which is 2 o'clock. Oh, because
Time, yeah.
I thought the time just changed everything, because it's 3 o'clock almost my time. And
yeah, daylight savings confuses us all.
yeah, I just got the invitation, and I thought, what happened here? Okay, thank you. Sorry. And now I need to go because I have, turns out I have to go after all. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, that logic of the psychic, psychological, that trickster playing with words. I'm really embarrassed that I didn't get more from that sentence on my own. But the suke, I'm not the authority on Greeks, but you know, if you have a live person and you kill them, all the matter is still there, but they're not alive. They're not orium. But you can weigh them, you can do whatever. It's all still there. What's missing? Well, in Greece, or in Greek, Greece, what's missing was the suke, the animating force. The shades in Hades have no weight. So, you know, they're just the animating force. You know, and so when you start studying the rules, I won't say rules, maybe the principles, the arche, the logic of that animating force. You know, exactly what psychology today doesn't study. It studies statistical stuff that, you know, among groups or whatever, I don't know, behaviors, doesn't study the animating force usually. I'll have to say, I read that, and my habits of going back to the Greek and what might this mean in Greek completely took the day off or something like that. But I was pleased that you chose this sentence to expand on. But I think the psychological should deal with the arche that govern human organisms. Oh, well.
I'm with you. Yeah, I mean, I didn't get this the first time I read this, and I read it multiple times before we started this seminar, and I didn't get it. And I don't know what, you know, maybe it's the way Kenneth's philosophy works is it has to cook in you for a while. And when it cooks in you for a while, certain things that are personal to you, idiosyncratic to you, are going to come into focus at different times in it. And suddenly you see all this stuff that clearly he put there on purpose. I mean, a devoted Heraclitean like Kenneth Smith doesn't put these three words in a sentence like this by accident. You know, this is obviously intentional, but I read it many, many times and didn't see it. All I could see, this is why I keep harping on, every time I harp on modern misreadings, I'm not trying to point the fingers at you guys and say, you guys misread this stuff, but I see it right. I'm trying to say, I know that this is a liability because I misread it many times before one day, by coincidence, as I was prepping, you know, like 3 months ago, as I was prepping to go through this paragraph, you know, I started writing an essay, and in the course of writing, I suddenly slowed down on this part, and for the first time I saw what he was saying there. And it's obvious that we're not reading that into it.
Yeah. If you understood, or if this is what the psychological meant, I don't think the Greeks had a word like that. I think that's a neologism for us.
Freud.
It would be, this is sort of a riff on know thyself. Understand the principles, the arche of human nature.
Yeah.
You know, so, wow. That know thyself, that's something.
Everything comes from it.
Well, any existential philosophy, you know, must start there.
Yes. Yes.
There is no other beginning.
Where is the problem of life? Well, it starts with the fact that I'm alive. I'm the problem. There are many other problems that we could talk about, but there's one problem that's everywhere I look and everywhere I go, and that's me. I'm introducing difficulties. Yeah, I got really excited when I found this 3 months ago in this clause, and I wrote a whole bunch about it, and I did just what you did. I ultimately said, where this comes from is Gnothi Seauton. This, this is a Heraclitean expansion of Gnothi Seauton designed to expose and focus attention on this particular problem, which is that there is an intelligence to the constitution of our mind and spirit that is not the conscious intelligence. The conscious intelligence is so easily misled. It's that my conscious logic is an idiot that makes all kinds of countless mistakes, but underneath that is this deeper logos, which is, why am I the way that I am? Just like, why do trees grow the way that they grow? There is this underlying intelligence, and that intelligence is smarter than the surface intelligence, because that intelligence evolved over billions of years. That's still a product of evolution, like the trees are. Unlike my idiotic ideas that I got in school or by reading a newspaper. Those things are just ephemera, like cheap new versions of Microsoft Windows or this year's newly repainted car. That's the stuff that's not worth focusing on, because it's a distraction from what really matters. So what you talked about is exactly where I'm going in the rest of today's session, and we'll dig into that in a bit. But first, Phil, because he's got his hand up. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned in the sense that I'm sort of in between. Part of the problem is I see it as a form, but part of the problem, I also see it as a spirit. And my thought is, like, what is the relationship? Because the body of any species have many, many parts of the material. Where did this spirit come from? Or is it just somehow the relationship of all the parts creates a mystery that we can't explain? And I put it in a more simple term, maybe not more simple term, but it's like maybe a Heideggerian term, is like the difference between, and I always make the difference between like nature 1 and nature 2. Nature 1 is like minerals. Nature 2 is living organic substance. Somehow there's something that transforms mere materials into living material, or material that what I would say is that has care. It cares to continue to live. And I myself, in painting fallen angels, I call that ultra materiality, rather than maybe ultra materiality, whatever the hell that is. It has a part of that spirit. In other words, it cares. And I don't know whether it cares because it somehow senses on a deep level that his life is limited and I want to continue as long as it can, whatever the reason is. And it struggles against, other living things and mere material, and it tries to somehow sustain itself because it doesn't want to just become a rock, and all that sort of stuff. Because somehow there's a very primitive form of consciousness that knows that it's different. And I often think of this, this sort of species called stomactolites, which is a coral fossil of a cyanobacteria that was able to transform. It's just amazing to think, like this dumb animal, which is just it's a bacteria, was able to find some way to break down molecules and release oxygens into the atmosphere. And talk about transforming the world. I mean, human beings might destroy the world, but we're not the first ones. The cyanobacteria, actually, there was living things that oxygen was poisonous, and they released oxygen, and eventually a lot of the species got killed. But lucky for us, if it didn't do that, we would not exist. That's all there is to it. Should there be a temple to the cyanobacteria that gave us life? Really, I mean, in a way, it's like, I mean, is that a god? I mean, I just find it mysterious, but how? I mean, I'm sure it didn't say, I'm going to do this and kill off other things, but it just wanted to survive, and somehow it's able to sustain itself. And in some sort of unconscious way, it sustained itself at the detriment of some other things. And I wonder, I don't want to go so far as to say, well, who cares if we kill off all the species in the world? I mean, just because we have atomic bombs. I don't want to be that way, because we have developed this sort of like this sense for caring into something that we could actually think. And I think there is something that's different between human beings and animals. I mean, not that they can't think, but they can't think to the level that we could think. So I think we could maybe, in a sense, double back and say, have care for other things, otherness. So yeah, it just seems to me, still, I don't think we know what the hell that thing is that we call a spirit. I mean, I don't want to take it down as simple as the forms, because, like, yeah, I could explain that, for instance, a bicycle is made of many parts, and the parts by themselves is not a bicycle, right? To have a bicycle, you have to put it together in the right way. I mean, that's the Platonic form in a way, right? In the right way. If you put it in the wrong way, then you have a piece of art, or maybe in the junkyard. That's all you have. Like Picasso put it in a different way, and suddenly you have a bull. So in some sense, the forms could be rearranged, but I think this life force is something different. It is part of that putting things together in the right way, but there's something that happens, and we can't explain it. I don't want to quite put it as like, well, it is a mystery. I don't want to put it in a sense it's magic. I mean, like, but I don't know what it is. But it's definitely there for living matter, from the cyanobacteria on up to us, and maybe beyond that. I mean, that's what I can't understand, but we definitely have it, and we need to respect it on some point. Yeah. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, you're laying the ground for where we're going today for sure. There is this prejudice in the mechanistic worldview of modernity that we think that everything operates according to physics. We think physics is the fundamental language of the cosmos. That's those of us who don't become hyper intellectual and say, nah, physics is a cheat, it's actually math. But at any rate, there's this tendency to mechanize everything and turn it into an equation or a machine. And of course, what do we know about machines? They run down. But the thing about machines is they fall apart. They don't last forever. You have to sort of protect them and insulate them from reality and create these vacuum-like sterile conditions to prevent them from falling apart. And so we end up with this entropic view of the cosmos in which we can't explain where life came from. It sort of demands a creator, because our model for nature is everything falls apart, and yet somehow life happens, so that must be God. And we do that because we don't see the way in which it's a circular argument. We've actually created the conditions for asking the question the way that we have, because the minute we take our thumb off of Chernobyl, nature springs back everywhere. It's like, it may not be fully healthy nature, but man, it's going. And it didn't run down, it ran up. Our machine ran down, and after it ran down, nature ran up, because that's what Mother Nature does. The principle of life is in opposition to the principle of entropy. It hyper organizes things instead of disorganizing them over time. And for us, that's hard to express. But Heraclitus was fascinated by this. And he said, well, that doesn't just happen. That happens because there is an intelligence at work. But it is, and this is kind of part of what's implied by this reference to the logos, it's an alien intelligence. It's not a human intelligence. It's not what we think of as intelligence. All our definitions for intelligence are going to point us in precisely the wrong direction to understand it for what it is. He's not saying there's some dude with a beard somewhere and a drafting table. He's saying the opposite of that. Nature is intelligent without intention, without design, without deliberation and ego and will. And that intelligence, that what Kenneth calls pre-conscious intelligence, is in many ways superior to ours because it winds the universe up into greater and greater forms of organization, whereas we have a tendency to be stupid and knock things over. You know, we can't imagine intelligence without the ego, so we think that must be the best kind. But what Heraclitus sees is that the intelligence full of ego is the worst kind. The intelligence we're familiar with is the mortal intelligence, emphasis on mortality, where all our stupidity comes from. You know, it's why we struggle to achieve the survival grace that a cheetah can pull off. How the hell does the cheetah do that? I mean, it's just astonishing that it's not like Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. It doesn't have a drafting board. It's not buying parts from Acme Computer Corporation and assembling. You know, it's the cheetah is its own solutions, and the things that it wants to do are pointing in the wrong direction. You know, it's not running around trying to shoot up with heroin or trying to conquer the world and execute all the gazelles to prove what a big cheetah it is. All of those things that happen so often with conscious, mortal, egotistic intelligence, they're all these things in nature are almost entirely free from. It's staggering to compare the two. So this is what he's talking about when he says we have to learn to give up our loyalty to what we assume is the best form of intelligence, which is our own private intelligence. And we have to attach our loyalty instead to this hidden harmony at work that makes a cosmos out of everything, because it succeeds more often than we do. And we have things to learn from it. So what's interesting, and where the real nuance in this, Gnothiseauton stuff comes from, is this idea that Heraclitus has that same organizing structure to the cosmos outside of us is also operating in the structure of the human mind itself. The very stupidity of our intelligence that frustrates us is produced, it's an epiphenomenon of this deeper intelligence, which is akin to the deeper intelligence outside of us. That is, the logos is at work, creating trees and oceans and rivers and volcanoes. It's also at work inside of us, generating human character and drives and the capacity to begin asking questions about the universe. That's also a product of the logos. And so we need to use not just mere metaphor or analogy, but actual comparison and contrast between the two to try to get some understanding of who and what we actually are. We need to see the parallelism, because the way that you know that the logos is at work inside of us is that the logos is at work inside of everything we can see in nature, and we are also in nature. So it's got to be at work inside of us too. That was his starting point after Gnothiseauton, from which he developed his whole framework of daimons and so forth. It
was epiphenomena, was it?
Yeah.
Or epiphenon.
Yeah. He doesn't use any of those words, but yeah, you're right. That's
epiphenomena. Okay, thank you.
That's useful language. Thank you. Yes. So, if at modern reading, the mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic, logic inherently includes consciousness and will and intellect and education. It inherently includes them. We aren't able to conceive of an intelligence that isn't conscious. We aren't able to conceive of an intelligence that can do amazing things and isn't educated. We think education and discipline and systematization and all those things Noesis cherishes we think that makes it intelligence, and that without those things, it would be some form of stupidity. We can't buy the idea that ego and education and will and all that stuff also generates our stupidity, that there is an intelligence before consciousness that is present in nature and present in us that contributes to our drives to know and to learn and to develop and to become better than we are if we don't thwart those natural drives. The other part of this that's really worth emphasizing, other than the unconscious nature of this deeper intelligence, is that it doesn't operate in parts and pieces. Like Phil was saying, it operates in wholes, right? The cheetah is not assembled out of anything. it's self-assembling from itself, and it unfolds its order from itself, from containing the seeds of future order, and that in so doing, it not only does it form the whole that is itself, but it learns within the larger context of nature, such that the way that it feels and senses and remembers and experiences automatically plugs it into the larger whole in a way that forms a greater whole. So the cheetah becomes part of the balancing, along with the natural tendency of a gazelle population to rise. The gazelles keep it from getting out of control. And the gazelle population helps keep the cheetah population from getting out of control. It forms a palintropy, right? A bending back of the forces upon each other to create a dynamic system that's able to be more alive than the parts could have been by themselves. That is a natural consequence of the capital L logos. But it's not a natural consequence. In fact, it's a damn difficult consequence to produce if we're talking about our intellect, our logic. Noesis has a terrible time trying to accomplish that sort of thing because it's all based on paradoxes, and Noesis hates paradoxes and tries to avoid them. And thereby, it avoids the very conditions it ought to be striving to create, which is dynamic self-correcting systems that are paradoxical to try to talk about. So this kind of whole-forming quality of this intelligence, this is, if you know the Kenneth Smith, Greek, Hegelian, etc. framework, you can see that gnosis has to play a critical role here. Begriff has to play a critical role here, because that's the whole forming faculty within the brain, the one that wants to relate us to what we're feeling, to what we're sensing, to what we're remembering, that wants to create a larger whole. Whereas noesis is trying to cut things apart, to analyze them, to assess them, to create a machine of the intellect that we can turn that crank and predict the future with. There is no path that goes strictly out of Begriff and into Verstand that ever leads to the capital L logos. It gets us farther and farther from the capital L logos. It does help us develop things we need in order to get to the third form of the mind, the mature form of the mind, but it's taking us away from what we need to form wholes the way the logos does. And it's why the forms of foolishness that are created by noesis are so much more dangerous than the forms of foolishness that are created by mere naive parochialism. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to pose this as a question because it's, I previously made a divider line. I mean, I moved the divider line from Plato back to life and the material, mere material and living material. But I wonder whether I need to move that line back. And I'm thinking specifically of the double slit experiment. Because the double slit experiment seems to project that when you have a single proton, a singularity, it is very random. You don't know where it's going to go. Just like if you have a group of people in a civilization, everyone is sort of special and individual. But when you have large numbers, it seems like it forms a wave pattern. I mean, like, is there something that in some sense is deeper than even life in the sense that it has an organizational relationship that is itself, and I don't want to quite go to the point of saying it's a living structure, but there seems to be kind of a knowing between the specific particle, I mean, the specific photon, and the many photons. The relationship between the one and the many, as we talked about in civilization, between Geist and Zeitgeist. And like, I wonder what, I don't want to say that, oh, that's the Zeitgeist working. But there is a kind of mystery in that. I mean, if at all, it's not just in our mechanical instruments that produce that weird effect. I actually don't think it is, although it probably has some influence on it. But how is it that the singularity, which is absolutely mysterious, like where the hell is going to be, turns out it all works out? I mean, perhaps not as cleanly as we expect, because I think, you know, I'm sure the wave forms different forms of wave, but how is it they sort of sing in a chorus together when you have a bunch of, you know, solo singers that don't know what the hell is going on? I mean, is there something, should the divided line be moved back, all the way back to material itself, and there's a relationship between substance and spirit? I don't know. I mean, that's why I want to leave it as a question, because the double slit experiment is a very mystery. You know, it's like, you know, that I think, you know, people are now in astrophysics talking about, you know, quantum wave theory. You know, and it's like, is the universe a living thing? I mean, that would go beyond Heraclitus in a way, because he didn't conceive the universe that way. He just saw nature in a localized scene. So, I mean, this is beyond me to even venture. That's why I want to ask as a question for you to, you know, I am Hermes bringing you back the information. Now I want your wise counsel to give you wisdom and interpret that. That's my question. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Well, you know, this is that thing that he's talking about in chapter 4, is this idea that to the ancients, if you didn't have any better explanation, your default explanation was not a thing or a mechanism, but an organism. So the universe is an organism. You know, it's not in the sense that we think of it. You know, if somebody's, when we first hear about the Gaia theory, we think somebody's saying that the Earth is an animal or a plant or something. We think it must have a nucleus and DNA. We start trying to make a direct comparison to a cell. But to the Greeks who hadn't discovered those things, what makes an organism is not any of those specific details of biology, but rather the fact that it is a cosmos rather than a chaos, that it pulls itself together and winds itself up. You know, that its internal conflicts are harnessed into these polyntropes, these dynamic systems that reinforce the existence of the whole. And by that definition, Heraclitus and the other early Greeks certainly thought of the universe as an organism. I mean, the word cosmos itself inherently contains the concept of an organism, because when they're talking about, you know, when the Greeks are praising themselves for their fighting force, they're saying what makes our fighting force great is that individual egos and intentions within the fighting unit have been sublimated and harnessed so that the unit has shared intentions, and all of the parts work to the good of the whole, and the whole works for the good of the parts. So these, you know, they're using the metaphor of an organism to describe the fighting unit, which they call a cosmos. And then from that it goes back. So they're going both directions at the same time. And this is typical of the ancient Greeks, this kind of polyvalence, you know, in which, you know, Go ahead, Phil. I can see you're about to say
Yeah,
something.
could I ask that it seems like the self-organizing, self-generating thing is in a way the deep principle, because on the one hand I see a real relationship between Newton's deist idea, but his had a creator.
Mm-hmm.
The creator withdrew and left the residue of the structure there.
Right.
So the difference is that there was no creator as self-generating versus that there was that prime mover that created, and now he left the scene. It's up to Newton to trace out the sketch of the deist who
Yes.
left the scene, and said, now it's up to you, universe, to take care of yourself. And so there's a funny relationship between deism and that, except for the origin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Deism is related, but you go, but it's got that.
Mechanical.
Deism is what happens when a modern learns about the Greeks and tries to take it in.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there's still a mechanism left. They
Right.
can't visualize it without that part. But there's a Heraclitus line that a lot of people skip over, but that's right on this very subject, in which he talks about that the universe, didn't have a beginning and won't have an end. It always was and always will be self-creating, like an eternal fire, igniting in measures and going out in measures. And a lot of people who are real Heracliteans have spent some time trying to work out what exactly he's saying there. But part of what's indicated is this idea that what happens within it is not random, but is calibrated or self-calibrating, so that as things become too much, they fade away, and as they become too little, they return. There is this idea of exchanges of energy involved in keeping it going. And Heraclitus is struggling with the ancient Greek language to try to figure out how to say what he's got in mind. But ultimately he's saying that the universe is rationing its energies and applying them in such a way that it's creating itself at all times. So he's pretty much saying what you're talking about, just without the mechanism involved. That's the part that he would have thought, what? No, that's not how things work. And that sense that when you touch an organism or affect it in any way, that it knows that it's been touched and it responds. And the Greeks distinguished between things that only seem to respond slowly or obliquely, like a tree, versus things that responded almost immediately, like an animal. But they still saw that both of them do it. They both have this self-awareness and desire to both exist and to become whatever it is they're in the process of transforming into. So yeah, it's all there. It's all there, right there in Heraclitus. They saw it that way. And there's a line, I can't remember who said it, who's talking about, maybe it's Plato actually, who's talking about this fluxus quo, this concept of everything. Nature is the realm of change, in which they say it's not just the philosophy of Heraclitus. They say it's the philosophy of Heraclitus and Homer. And that's another one that has exercised a lot of Heracliteans. They're like, where did Homer ever say all things flow? And a lot of them seem baffled by it. But I think it's right there in the ancient Greek word phusis, which Homer uses for nature repeatedly, because phusis means becoming or flowing. So this idea of the cosmos as being an organism, constantly changing, constantly recreating itself. We may go back to Heraclitus a lot, but I don't think he invented any of these ideas. I think he's just putting into the most rhetorically interesting language to date what the ancient Greeks naturally believed as a people before the development of their logos culture. So, Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
was just going to say, there's something when I go into the idea of past incarnations and believe that I can look through details of several different incarnations, and what intrigues me is this other aspect to the mind. There's a superficial mind, there's a superficial me. The superficial me wants to be in class and wants to get a gold star from the teacher after a few weeks of effort. It has certain aims, but there's this other self which seems to be deeper, that has different motives. For example, this other self seems to be somehow aware of the information from past lives, but normally that's not going to go over into the ordinary self. And this other self has no interest in telling the ordinary self about external details about former incarnations. Normally, this other self has a different program going. For example, this other self does have questions and is looking for certain types of answers. And for example, I might see in a former incarnation a question which arose maybe 6,000 BC, I don't know. And this other self somehow felt it encountered an answer in about 400 AD. So after about 6,500 years, it got a little bit of an answer in what it was looking for. But this secondary mind is there. It knows things which the ordinary superficial mind might be curious about, but it's not trading in these curiosities. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That at least works as a metaphor for, kind of the vast part of our mind that isn't under our conscious control. The Greeks and Hegel and Kenneth Smith talk a lot about, what are the drives within us? What are the things, whether we choose them or not, that preoccupy us, or if we aren't aware of it, if we haven't bumped into it yet, will surprise us when we encounter something, and then suddenly we're fascinated by it. And where did that fascination come from? And, Kenneth Smith's answer is, the intellect prides itself on its willful choices, but hardly anything that our mind does is actually willful. The will is sort of validating what it has, the impulses, the unclear, inchoate, dark impulses to attach itself to. It doesn't know why it's interested in the things it's interested in. And that, the whole art of storytelling is about the distinction of the need from the want. And the want, we might know that we have this, well, I want my new car, I want to marry that girl, or what have you. But none of that may be what we need. We may not even know what we need, but somewhere within us is this longing for that thing that is unclear to us. So, that ties into what we were talking about a moment ago with this idea of the logos with the capital L, incorporating this preconscious element that's incredibly potent. But I'm also going to draw in something you referred to earlier when you were talking about the trichotomy between the body, the soul, and the spirit, and say, you get a word like psyche. It's not including the body, but it does include kind of the English terms soul, mind, and spirit. So, our ability to think, the Greeks associated in part with the psyche, the soul with the psyche, the spirit with the psyche, all of these things together were involved. And so what you have here is, you have Kenneth Smith playing with the term psychological by breaking it apart into logos and psyche. But in doing that, he's and by choosing the word psychic, but by doing that, he's trying to get us to think about language more the way that the ancient Greeks did, in which just because you combine some terms to make a new term doesn't mean that the root meanings go away. In English, they kind of go away. Psychology or psychiatry to us means a specific thing, like it's a discipline and you can get a degree in it and blah, blah, blah. We aren't thinking about it as logos and psyche. But the Greeks, if they had coined a term like psychology, they would have thought of it that way. And for them, the logos of the suke would have been not just carried along as a remembered phrase, but would have been the whole point of the thing. That's why you put those words together, is to investigate the logo. It would be unforgettable that the subject was the logos of the suke, or as Donald said, Gnothi Seauton. It'd be right there in your face. So, this is the challenge that we have as English speakers. English is a language that has been, I think I'll use a organic chemistry term and say denatured, in which we are trying to linearize our language and make each word mean one or a set of things. And that's it. That's what they mean. And when you speak, most of the time you pick one of those meanings, and that's the meaning that you intend. And that's therefore the only meaning that this sentence can have. The Greeks didn't write that way. I mean, Heraclitus confounds people to this day by the way in which he liked to play with words. He liked to say things so that it wasn't just one reading of the sentence that was what he meant, but alternative meanings were also what he meant. That is, they weren't just some Easter egg or bonus freight that was along for the ride, or that if you wanted to express yourself, you could express yourself by playing with his language. He had already played with the language. And in something like Ethos Anthropoi Daimon, he's really talking about anthropoi on multiple levels at the same time: the individual, the culture, the civilization, the epoch of history, the entire species. They all have a nature that is the consequence of a character and how it expresses itself as the logos of that character, as its archai unfold and interact with each other through polyntropy. All of that, he's saying all of those sentences at the same time with those three words. It's the same with the final word, daimon, in it. He's meaning that both figuratively and literally. That, on the one hand, it's like it's a god over you. Your character is like a god over you in that, it has the ultimate authority over your choices. But it's also not just like a god. The fact that it has that authority makes it a god, according to the Greek polytheistic religion. The Greek polytheistic religion is trying to collect into a pantheon what are all the things that have authority over you. And it's trying to collect them so that it can teach you about them, so they can warn you what to watch out for in life. You need to know what those authorities are. And therefore, your character, your inner character, isn't just metaphorically like a god. By the Greek religious definition, it is a god. And the fact that it's preconscious and not visible to us doesn't in any way affect the sacredness of the authority that it has over us, and therefore our consequent responsibility to try to learn about it, to try to avoid, getting ourselves into a mess. This use of suke to mean soul and mind and spirit all at the same time. And every time suke appears in a sentence, you've got to read it every which way. And by the way, as long as we're saying those, I may not be able to say body, but I can still be with Stephen to say, how about breath, right? Because like the Navajo, they believe that you inhale your suke with your first breath when you're born, and that when you die, you exhale your suke, and then you don't take another breath, and that's why you no longer have an animating spirit in you. So literally the breath is also a fourth definition of suke that's always present in every sentence where suke appears. So Kenneth Smith is playing with these words in a Greek way in this sentence in order to turn what looks like a single sentence into a whole passel of sentences, each of which he means. And he does that because he's like Nietzsche, right? He wants to say in 10 sentences what somebody else says in a book, or what they can't even manage to say in a book, but it might take 10 books to say. And he wants to do that for the same reason Nietzsche does, which is once you've seen Heraclitus pull this trick, you're like, why would I do anything else? Why would I use language in some inferior way? I'd feel like I was, going to a classical concert in torn, dirty jeans and a t-shirt. I got to put on my best face here. I gotta deliver the best that I have, because this is the awesome company I want to keep. I've got to try to be worthy of these guys. So here, Suke, and I'll call on Phil in a moment. I won't forget you. You know, Suke, the Greeks have this polyvalent term. Logos is another such polyvalent term that has these incredible meanings. It carries whole bookcases full of books with it in one word. And that's by design. I mean, you have to remember the generation before Heraclitus, the generation of Thales and other really early philosophers, that was the generation where they were obsessed with what is the shortest statement I can make that contains the most wisdom? How many seeds of philosophy can I pack into just a few words? And they were so serious about it that they're carving it on stone pillars and setting them up all over the Greek world, including Alexander later setting it up on the borders of India. Everywhere they go, they're obsessed with, we have to, the power of the aphorism to try to encapsulate an explosion of wisdom. So that's why they want these polyvalent terms. And of course, not any polyvalent term will do. The definitions have to complement each other and expand on each other and reveal things. You know, the ultimate meanings have to reveal extra things that enrich the meaning of the sentence. It can't just be you go to a dictionary and open it randomly to 3 pages and throw a dart and those are your meanings. I mean, it's there's an art to this. It's quite difficult. So this should be familiar to us because we were talking about Geist, Hegel's Geist, the same way, right? The philosophy to Geist. Geist, the English translators can't decide whether that book is the philosophy of the mind or is it the philosophy of the spirit, but they always pick one because an English speaker can't imagine what it's like to deliberately use polyvalency in this way that the Germans and the Greeks are deliberately using it. And as a result, we've got the deck stacked against us when we're trying to understand the ancient perspective, right? So we're trying to strip things down to tiny little atoms of meaning that can be strung in little linear syllogisms, and none of that has anything to do with the Greek concept of nature or of ethos, logos, mythos, psyche. All of these things are in that older, richer idiom. And why is it richer? It's richer because, on purpose, it's richer because they are concerned above all with the struggle of a finite being to understand an infinite cosmos. We don't have time. We're not going to live long enough. So you have to pack as much juice of meaning as you can into each expression to try to transcend the limitation of the 7 plus or minus 2 things you can keep in your head at one time. Because if you can keep ethos, anthropoi, daimon in your head, you've cheated, in effect. As a finite being, you've cheated and you've packed something closer to infinity into those 3 words. So it gives you an Archimedean lever to try to overcome the enormous disadvantage we're at by having a finite mind. Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just like the way you, in a way, just sing the hymns of poetry. Because what it means that, you know, you could interpret poetry as just kind of ambiguous, or you could just see it as packing in the surplus of possibilities. And this surplus means that you could unfold in greater and greater depth. And that unfolding reminds me very much of Nietzsche's eternal return. You're returning to the same thing, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a cycle. It is a cycle, but more like you're drilling down deeper and deeper into the relationship. So the conceptual drill. And so, but what poetry does is makes reading in a way harder, because it makes it a kind of a living language in a sense, because the thing with something like a much more clear language is you've stripped it down and somebody had to do the thinking, but once the thinking is done, you could just sort of follow along, you know, and like I say, coast. With poetry, like, they haven't done the work for you in that sense. They left it all compact and you have to drill down and reorganize it in this eternal return to whatever the thing is, which means that it actually encourages people to have to continually think rather than say, oh yeah, that's already been done. It's been all worked out by Kant. It's been all worked out, by mathematics. It's been all worked by the engineers. So we got to a point where we actually know very little. We just know the specific area dealing with, and everybody, all the other things are taken care of. So if the plumbing breaks down, you call the plumber. I don't know how to do that. Let's call it a specialist. And so that's why we have to develop a culture of specialization, because we can't think beyond our small little turf that we can think. And so I think it's in some ways more demanding, because it keeps unfolding, and you, in a way, you don't know when to stop, which means you have to keep thinking. You have to keep asking questions, which, by the way, rather than the fact that, oh no, you see, the answer is always. I remember when I came to this country, I had, I'm not a very good reader, and the teacher gave me the secret to reading, and the reading was, you read the first paragraph and you find the topic sentence, and you go to the end and you find the answer to the conclusion, and then you can bracket all the middle in between. It's aha, I have the pathway already from the beginning, and I got the telos. and that and it has all the answers, because you got the question, you got the answer, and you just follow all the arguments. So whereas I always think of it as it's like you're trying to write, a creative, and you have to keep revising and rethinking it over and over again, and all that. It's which means that you have to keep on thinking as you're going through it, and even in editing. So yeah, thank you for singing the hymns, the poetry. We lost that art. In fact, we despise it by and large.
Thank you, Phil.
That's it, Phil.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got an odd. I mean, I certainly see how, when you get to these highly polyvalent, what Kenneth Smith calls mnemonic writers, like Heraclitus and like some others, the boundaries between philosophy, poetry, and religion disappear. They're talking about profound things in a decisive, meaningful way, but they're doing it in a way that compresses so much meaning into such a small space, it acquires this hypnotic, potent beauty. I mean, like Gnothi Seaton. How can so much be in those two words? And as part of my ongoing project to translate Heraclitus and write commentary upon him, I've been going back to the Greek and doing more Greek side by side with the English. And man, he plays with words. Oh my God, it is poetry. He's constantly having phrases with parallel constructs in which he changes one letter. And now the second iteration is a completely different clause, but he has compelled you to make an analogy between them by their rhythm and rhyme. And it's almost all lost in English. You occasionally see it peek out as paradox, when he says, the name of the bow is life, but its work is death. Bios. He's making a pun on the word bow and the word life and the word and and of course it's used to kill. So he's setting up that paradox that way, and of course he's using that as a commentary on polyntropy and how it operates within us, and the good that it can do and the ill that it can do and everything else. And yeah, it's poetry. I mean, it's there's just no two. So I've been on a poetry kick for the last year or two, very consciously, and even my medical programming work I'm doing, I'm working on a new standard for the programming language used in medicine. And I'm adding examples, and all the examples are poetry examples. And that's the first time we've ever done that in our standard. And so I'm having a lot of fun doing a review of poetry. It's very much on my brain. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
When I was thinking about this trichotomy of the mind, as the Hermetics had it, you had body, soul, and spirit, which is still bandied around today. And I was wondering what was the difference, and I came to the conclusion the soul seems to be, well, something like the mind, and it processes information. For example, an animal will have certain needs and seek certain needs in nature. Man has invented shopping. We have shopping emporiums. We wander around these emporiums, according to some like zombies, looking at all the great stuff that the shops have to sell us, pleasing our senses. So this is a far more developed experience than the simple one that the animal engages in, which is more reliable. Another aspect is the intellect, that we have an intellect which processes ideas. But I don't think any of the things, it doesn't actually create anything. I'll give you an example. I could be some small furry animal down the bottom of a hole, and I just spend all my time there. And occasionally an insect drops in, and I go, "Oh, goody, insect. Yum, 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 yum. Eat insect." And I would probably develop ideas like, "Oh, if only I could, a bigger and more tasty insect could fall down that hole one day, or a whole flood of insects could come down." In other words, my appreciation of the world is based on what's come empirically. I'm not imagining being a human, driving in a car, getting home and turning on the TV to watch Dallas. I wouldn't be able to create that imagination. I could process that if I actually had the inputs. So I came to the conclusion that what they defined as spirit was something that actually doesn't merely process information, but creates information. So I'd probably put at the foot of the spirit, for example, imagination. Not just imagination as we think of it, but imagination that actually can create scenarios which are beyond the inputs. I don't think mankind actually has that ability. I agree with Jung. Jung talked about this spirit as being the archetypes, but they're something that's being given to us in our mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the issue of spirit is going to be one that we really get into when we enter the medieval epoch. While we're in the ancient epoch, we're talking a lot about the virtues of the ancient epoch, and you've noticed from time to time I take us aside and remind us of some of its vices. There's a reason the epoch had to end, especially when you get into the really corrupt period of Rome. Today I was reading about Quintilian's great 12-volume work on rhetoric, and skimming parts of it, reading passages of it, and how the whole thing was written not just as a celebration of and training manual in rhetoric, but because he was writing at the time the Emperor Domitian had created such a fascist culture in Rome. He had secret police everywhere spying on everyone. He's trying to create a totalitarian state in which nobody could criticize the Roman emperor. And of course, ironically, he himself was in need of a great deal of criticism, not least for doing these things, but he was driving it out of Roman culture. Rhetoric had been this huge, highly revered thing, but now you were likely to get yourself executed if you started declaiming, about things that mattered. So, the commentary was talking about how Quintilian's work on the surface appears to be this simple handbook. I mean, big, but a handbook about how to do rhetoric, when in fact it is a disguised political commentary saying what a disaster the great powers have made of the Roman Republic by this point. The empire that they've turned it into is so corrupted. It's destroying the potential for the creation of Aristoi. All of that, and as you remember from previous months, we've talked through this section F, Kenneth Smith ties rhetoric to one of the duties. Eloquence is one of the duties of an Aristos, because the whole advantage of developing the mature adult Homo sapiens mind is the capacity to begin to develop a greater wisdom that you can then turn around and communicate to people who haven't come that far, so that they can follow in your footsteps and surpass you. You're trying to stack the deck in favor of the development of more and more people with more and more wisdom, rather than letting people sink to their lowest level. So, what Domitian was doing was, to the eyes of people like Quintilian, was destroying the capacity for virtue in ancient Rome, and is killing the spirit, right? He was killing the spirit. So and worse things were to come. So, the rebellion, the medieval uprising that led to the destruction of the ancient epoch and the rise of the medieval epoch, it was due, it was necessary. It was a stage of development. It was a process of development. It was one of those tough births we've talked about before that had to be gone through. And the consequences, for all that we now talk about the downsides of the medieval epoch as moderns, looking back and blaming them for everything that went wrong, and for all that, that it was what the ancients were trying to prevent happening, right? The ancients wanted the ancient epoch to continue. They didn't want it to be overthrown, in favor of the medieval epoch to come. Nevertheless, the medieval epoch, from its own perspective, and even from ours, if we learn to see it the right way, is going to turn out to have some strengths. There's a reason it developed. And one of its strengths is the focus on spirit. What is spirit? What is soul? What is mind? What is spirit? What are the relationships between them? Should you just passively accept the character that you have fatalistically and adopt whatever role that suggests? Or should you struggle to cultivate your character? And if so, how do you do that? What is the nature of that struggle? How do you put your soul in motion to try to rise? These are the concerns of spirit. Kenneth Smith elsewhere defines spirit as soul in motion. And, I think of that as part of the framework that he's establishing here. And another part of the framework is the way that he describes in ethos anthropoidaimon, the ethos, the character of the person, is like the character stamped onto the plain metal coin before it assumes its value. You put somebody specific onto the metal blank and it becomes a coin. Otherwise, it's just gold or silver or electrum or whatever it is. And that this is the ancient metaphor for the relationship between character and soul. Soul is the raw stuff you have to work with from whatever source, from whatever origin. And character is the specific combination of archai and their various palintropies that act as the generator of your personality, your will, your intellect, and so forth. So, I'm sort of working my way towards this ancient take on these things that says maybe a great deal of what I think I'm doing with my intellect and my will, that it thinks it's creating things. Maybe a lot of that is actually being created by my gnosis, from my begriff, from my preconscious mind. And then my conscious mind wakes up one day and says, Eureka, I have discovered X. When in fact, X was just lying there because it had already been created for it by my unconscious creative mind. That there is this way in which there's really no basis for the intellect to make an informed decision about whether it's creating anything or whether it's actually just discovering the products of the other half of the mind. Descartes can say, I think, therefore I am, but what evidence does Descartes have that it shouldn't be, I perceive, therefore I am? And maybe I just believe that I'm the one thinking when I'm perceiving somebody else's thoughts. And maybe that somebody else's thoughts are my unconscious mind creatively producing things through gnostic, begriff, whole-forming activities. I don't know. There's a lot of, it's like Heraclitus says, there is a lot of unknowns when you go delving into the self and the structure of the mind. And the moment we get into trouble is the moment where we start saying to ourselves, I know how this works. It definitely works like this. To which the appropriate answer is, yeah, sure, buddy. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was thinking of that, saying what you're saying in relationship to Hegel in this sense. I'll tie it to a common thing, like, because I'm always sort of a little bit mystified by the owl Minerva tick flight at dusk. Okay. And it reminds me of how that transition takes place. In other words, the transition is already there, present. It's not like it's a heartbreak. It's just migrated because you already know. I'll use the metaphor like, quite often, you fall in love. You suddenly feel like you fall in love. But it would be the typical thing, you're going out with the older sister, and then, like, there's the younger sister who's always harassing you. And, like, one day you realize, yeah, I'm in love with the little sister, the younger sister. Like, but you already knew that. It's just that it suddenly occurred to you. So everything, it was already there. You already knew it, but it just didn't surface to the surface of consciousness. Yeah, I'm in love. But you were already in love for a while. It was already. And then you pop into your consciousness. It's like, I'm more interested in the younger sister than the older sister. It's kind of like, yeah, I think so many of the things that we find ourselves like suddenly enlightened by, we were already there. And then the enlightenment suddenly comes like when you went to the mountaintop and the sun shines. You say, oh, yes, I realize that now. It's like, so the conscious mind is sort of like following there. And I think if it wasn't for the fact that you were already prepped for the hour of Minerva, it would become a shock. Like, and sometimes it is a shock, but most of the time it is already, you already were there to begin with. And then you turn around and say, yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's kind of authenticating what you're saying and what Hegel is in a funny way saying. That's why it doesn't take flight in the daylight. It's already prepping you for that moment to begin with. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I think that's why we say falling in love, because we imagine it's not real until it's conscious. But what actually happened is a long process of unconsciously falling in love, which didn't have the sensation of falling because it took a while. And then one day our conscious mind goes, whoa, I'm in love? We think it just happened at that moment. I use this faculty a lot in my work. I use it partially for the philosophy stuff, but especially when I'm trying to engineer the M programming language and figure out where can we take the architecture to add new capabilities without breaking a single line of code, in the existing application. So like Donald and I were talking about, you need that stability in evolution when you're doing medical software. So it's a very hard problem to think about because you're trying to change and not change at the same time. So my solution to this is I'll work it over and think about it a lot consciously while I'm awake, and then I'll go to bed. And then I'll let my unconscious work on it. And it is a freak. I mean, at least once a week, sometimes more than that, I wake up first thing in the morning and I've got the solution just right out of sleep. And it's because, I had 8 hours my unconscious chewing along, working on the problem and being able to create solutions that my conscious mind wouldn't have been able to come up with.
So in teaching, it seems like the direct approach might not be the right way. You have to prep them. You know, I mean, like, it's like they didn't even realize they were doing it suddenly. And then suddenly you say, well, this is what you've been doing all along. It's all that's interesting. It's kind of like the Karate Kid, right? Wax the car, like do the fence and all that. And he finally the Karate Kid says, when are you going to teach me karate? He says, I've been teaching you all along. He says, well, no, you've just been exploiting me. And then he punches him. He goes like this.
Yes.
He's like, he didn't even know.
That was beautifully written. That's beautifully written. It's right on the money. That's how you do it. You have to teach the body first, and it's hard at first because your conscious mind wants to get in and screw it up. It's like, well, I don't just want to do things. I have to control this. Like, no, just do them. Right?
Yeah, but what if the Karate Kid just decided he's been exploiting me? He never even come for the confrontation. He would never know. He just did all that damn work.
That's right.
For the master.
That's right.
For nothing, right? What are you going to teach me?
That's right. Yeah, it's studying the limitations of the conscious mind is a really interesting exercise, and it's epistemology effectively, when done right, is all about that. It's kind of what are the limits and liabilities of the mind, and subtitle to one of Kenneth Smith's books of aphorisms is called The Limits and Liabilities of the Modern Mind. I can't remember if that's Minotaur or Webb's. But it's like if you want to learn judo, you've got to learn what the body can and can't do so that you can learn how to work with it and not try to do something like you're not going to be able to pick up and throw a 400-pound dude with just bulging with muscles when you're a little scrawny squirt. You're just not going to be able to do it. And if you know that you can't do it, then you can learn to focus on the things you can do, which is to get him to throw his body at you in an attack, and then to step aside and guide him into the wall or the ground. I mean, he's doing all the work, right? Because he's got the muscles for it, and you don't have to. And you can do the little bit of work that your little squirt body is capable of, and voila, judo. So it's the same with the mind. We need this ability to learn what the limits of our mind are. The whole rah go human intellect. The human intellect is like a god. We can think anything and remember everything. This is bullshit, and it sets people up to fail. This is how you end up with a revolving door of idiots in charge of complex systems that they didn't spend any time learning about. But they're sure, because they're smart, they must be able to pull it off. They don't need decades of experience. They'll just walk in with their rude intelligence, and they'll see the thing that all the people who are there never could see before. They have this picture in their mind of, clever Hans or Jack from Grimm's fairy tales just waltzing into the situation, and through the dint of pure intellect and cleverness, they're just going to come up with the solution nobody else can see. And, we love that story. This is the propaganda of modernity. You don't need that philosophy stuff. Just be naive and smart, and you'll be able to solve any problem. But it's not true. Most problems are made worse when an intelligent idiot walks onto the scene, because an intelligent idiot can do forms of damage that a stupid idiot can't do. There are forms of stupidity that only a smart person is capable of. So it's like, this is like what we're talking about the structure of tragedy. The structure of tragedy is, it's caused by your virtues. It's because you're a finite being wielding those virtues that the tragedy ensues. And the moment we lose track of our finitude and we start to imagine ourselves as gods of intellect is the moment when, next thing we know, we've got concentration camps and world wars and cetacea and we can't figure out how did we get into this mess. Well, we were too sure of ourselves. We lacked the proper humility and curiosity about our limits. Donald, go ahead. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, that famous computer engineering slogan, just when we make a new system idiot-proof, they invent a new idiot.
Yep. I think that one might be in Murphy's Law. Yes, and the related one, the reason nothing can ever be made idiot proof is because idiots are so clever. Foolproof, I think foolproof is that one. Can't make it foolproof because fools are so clever. So so let's go back to polyvalency. So Aristotle, man is by nature a political animal. I'm going to compare and contrast this with Kenneth Smith's line that we quoted up above, where he said the mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic, right? And in that sentence, mythos, logos, and psyche are these incredibly loaded terms that are meant to be read polyvalently in a Greek way, not literally in a modern English way. So the same is true of Aristotle's line. This is one of my favorite examples of ancient polyvalence. Man by nature is a political animal. So what does he mean? So when a modern reads this, it looks like a claim, first of all. He's just saying that. And we feel entitled to decide whether Aristotle's just a savage, primitive idiot. Because he's not a modern, he's not a scientist like we are. So, somebody who is kind of not interested in science, but interested in scientism, in the trappings of science, the social rewards of being seen to be scientific and pretending to be scientific. This kind of rationalization that a lot of moderns do without ever practicing even a moment of science in their lives. That reading looks at this and says, well, they didn't have science back then. He probably doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm going to see if I can think of exceptions to prove him wrong. And that's where they then go into logic. Can I disprove this statement? There must be some kind of way to sabotage this noesis. Or if we believe him and we like him, we do the opposite, which is exactly the same behavior, just the other side of the coin, which is we start collecting, cherry-picking examples to rationalize what he said in order to shore it up and defend it from people who might attack it. We anticipate how might they attack it. We're like, oh yeah, well, maybe there's this case when such and such happened, so that proves that Aristotle's right. None of this has anything to do with what Aristotle's saying, right? So by nature, he's saying it's not him. It's not his claim. He's saying this isn't something I'm projecting onto the situation. It is inherent to the ethos of Homo sapiens. It is in its character. And anybody capable of looking at beyond the surfaces of things to see their underlying principles and character, their nature, can see that this is true. It's obviously true. And in political, what does he mean by that? Well, he doesn't mean what we mean. He doesn't mean they join political parties and put up bumper stickers and buttons and rallies and demonize their opponents for everything bad in society and canonize themselves for all the good things. He doesn't mean any of that stuff. That's disgusting modern pseudo-politics. He's talking about the polis. He's talking about the way people can overcome their natural familial and tribal parochialisms, because the Greeks were concerned about their tendency to dissolve into fighting tribes, and instead form a polis in which, rather than force or domination, they use persuasion, peitho, as the basis for welding together a whole organism that transcends these parochial boundaries. He's saying that people have culture, they form cultures, and that those cultures have a political economy that helps to hold them together in a healthy organismic fashion. That's what he's saying. And when he says this is a polyvalent sentence. So he's also saying any human being who detests politics or is obsessed with individualism, right? Anyone who lacks the nuance to understand that both the group and the individual are necessary. They're equally necessary in different ways. Anyone who doesn't understand there's a dynamic tension between them, that they're in conflict, and that they have to be harnessed into a palintropy. Anyone who doesn't get that is not human. They're not human. They are an animal, but they're like a baby. They're like someone suffering from a terrible, debilitating disease. You're not going to see in that person the core of what it means to be a Homo sapiens. right? Any animal, more or less, with basic functionality can, put some food in its mouth and poop. Those things are not the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens. And neither are a vast swath of other basic mammalian or animalian qualities. The core characteristic of Homo sapiens is this capacity to form a polis, right? The ability to create larger cultures composed of more than just self or family or tribe, to break down parochialism and create this larger structure, but to do it in a way. See, the Greeks understood the polis not as a place that suppressed the individual. He's also not talking about creating a totalitarian state. That would be equally non-political. The dynamic tension between the individual and the group that enables both of them to exist and to fulfill their functions, even though they're in direct contradiction of each other, is the polis. And politics is the art of the various forms of organization that allow a polis to thrive. Anything that people might do that they would call politics, but that would lead to the destruction of the polis, is not actually politics. The fact that we called it politics doesn't make it politics. It has to actually contribute to the health of the individual and the group in the relationship called a polis, or anything like it. So, for example, the way that Democrats and Republicans in the United States tear at each other and work at each other's expense is sub-political activity. That's not political. And the kind of state that we formed doesn't qualify as a political entity, according to Aristotle. We are living subhuman lives, according to Aristotle, because sometimes the group is too strong, sometimes the individual is too strong, but at no time do we have a genuine polyntropy of the form that he envisioned in a polis. So all of that's contained in this sentence, and all of it is meant by Aristotle in this sentence. None of that is a reading in. And we know that because of other things he wrote elsewhere. We know it because of the way he uses these words, because he uses the word man, the word nature, the word political, and the word polis, and the word animal. He uses all of them in polyvalent ways. Again, not the way modern English has multiple definitions and you pick one that you meant, but multiple simultaneous competing definitions, all of which are included so that they all illuminate each other and expand the scale of what you're saying in order to create a little poetry out of philosophy. That's what Aristotle's doing. And that's why at the same time, he's describing Homo sapiens, and he's also saying that anyone who hasn't risen to the level of being capable of doing that is not a good example of a human being. They're either immature or damaged. When Aristotle writes this, what he's consciously doing is he's critiquing the Greek civilization of his era as having fallen below the human level, that they're no longer capable of creating polites. They're not creating a genuine polis anywhere the way that they once did. He's saying, without using these words, he's saying that in the transition from mythos to logos, Greek civilization has already collapsed. And he's able to see it and comment on it by saying this. Just like Quintilian is saying Domitian has killed the Roman spirit, and now no one practices rhetoric anymore, which is why I can write a book like this, extolling the virtues of an art that nobody practices, but that everybody knows about. In the same way, Aristotle is saying, I'm looking at a sub-political, subhuman animal around me whose ancestors were human beings. We used to have adults, and now we don't. We just have these broken, damaged, kind of aborted quasi-humans. And he's not excluding himself, right? Because it's partially through Aristotle that we know that the ancient Greeks believed that you can't have Aristoi unless you have a culture helping as midwives with the third birth. They grow out of being a Banausos to become an Aristos. So he's saying all the necessary prerequisites to create that kind of mythos culture capable of having adult human beings who can have genuine politics, it's gone now. And we're in a collapse. And that's why he becomes the tutor to Alexander the Great and tries to teach him how to take over the Greeks successfully. He says, we've lost it. Our only hope is that some tyrant will come in and fix us because we're seriously broken. It's all there. It's all in these few words. But the critical thing that a modern can't see above all other things in this is the idea that when a modern human being says, oh, I don't like politics, politics is just messy, ugly stuff, that person is self-identifying as not an adult, not a genuine full Homo sapiens in the full flower of their powers. He's saying that's some kind of infantilized, aborted human being. And, you know, that doesn't mean you hurt it. It doesn't mean you put together death camps and commit genocide or anything, but it means you're looking at someone who's non-compos mentis. They're like a domestic cat. You have to take care of them because they don't know how to negotiate with other people and form a whole. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was been wondering about this whole modern racial debate. Now, the curious thing is a lot of the modern racial ideas come from the scientific racism of the 19th century. Of course, these scientifically minded people will tell us that racism arises purely from a primitive urge. It wasn't us in the 19th century that created a set of values that led to disaster. No, it was you primitives. You're the ones going wrong all the time. Not us hyper-rational beings. Never, never. It's never us. Never us. But of course, they had constricted the idea of race to something purely material. Now, when people talked about race prior to that, they were talking about something more extensive than just the idea of something that was material. They were talking about many other qualities. But there's a danger in the way people think now that they say you're part of a race or you're part of a group. And if we chop you off, you're still a part of the whole. But no, that's not the way it works. An individual will have group characteristics. An individual will have racial characteristics, but an individual is not a race by the very definition of the word. A race is always a group. It's only found in the group. It's not really found, it was at least not in a whole form, in an individual. Now, if you were to join a different race, that's quite possible as an individual, because the other group is a group. You join it as an individual. You can sort of join another group. You are not, as an individual, you are not stuck in the group you were born to. They don't understand the difference between the individual and the group. They have this very simple idea that you're like a piece of jelly and you're just chopped off and you're still the same essence. No, I don't fully understand it, but no, we're not the same essence. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's a hot area in Indigenous studies right now. You know, there's a lot of critiquing of US laws about determining who does or doesn't count as Native American, you know, who does or does not count as a genuine Native American tribe. And in Indigenous cultures, you see a lot of discussion of this idea that the blood quantum measurement of who is and isn't Indian was imposed on Indigenous peoples by scientific racists of the 19th century. You know, it's like, you know, this is a race and we're going to define it genetically or in terms of its blood, and people are either in or out. And a lot of Indigenous people will argue that what they care more about is their culture, their language, their religion. And if you embrace their culture and their language and their religion and take care of the people, then they may make you one of the people and say, yeah, you really are a Navajo, you really are a Lakota, you might be black or white or Asian, but you have spent your life taking care of the people according to our culture and helping our language stay alive and our stories. And so we adopt you. And when we imagine adoption, we imagine, white style adoption, like we'll pretend you are our kid. But Buffy St. Marie is a very timely example right now. But what they mean by adoption is you really are one of us. This is what defines us, not the scientific racist blood quantum, but the fact that we, what makes the people, like Dene, the word for Navajo is the people. What makes the people is, their practices and their language and the way that they care for one another. And if you're caring for the elders and the kids and all the things you're supposed to do, then by definition, you're one of the Dene. And now different, this is not a universal thing. Every indigenous people is a separate people, and you have to ask them, blah, blah, blah. But it's what you're talking about, Stephen. Yeah, this is hot right now. There a lot of indigenous people would agree with that. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wonder whether I don't have a little debate with Aristotle in this sense. Well, first of all, he might expect too much of a human being. I myself do as well, maybe not to the degree he does, because my fallen angels is really about the difference between being part of mankind and being human. But my thought is something like this. Is it even possible in modernity to actually retrieve his definition of human being in this sense? Because the polis, certainly at a certain size and a certain fragmentation of society, and I don't mean bickering, I just mean like there's so many different careers and so many different parts. People are distributed over so many different states and regions. Can you even have a polis? Or is a polis limited to something that's, let's say, 1 million at the most, but probably more like 50,000 or 250,000, I mean, like, so that there is some sense of unity and relationship, like we all go out and now we cheer for our football team. And even then we don't. We just, because we move around so much, we don't even cheer for the home team anymore. And to what degree is it that so many people, because they do fall beneath this line of being human, they just want civilization and the polis so that it could coast and be passive, like there's a lot more people standing in front of me before they get to me. That sort of thing. And to what degree do you just expel them from the city, from the polis? Or are they included as the free loafers, the free riders? I mean, how does that work? Because there are those people, probably even in the days of, well, Greeks were the best, So how does that work? I mean, yeah, you could talk about an ideal, but even Alexander, like he conquered all this place and he instituted, people at the very top and let the rest of them be whatever they are, part of mankind, maybe not human. But even then it was fragmented because he couldn't hold it together. I mean, he was dead. And although, the ones that the Ptolemaic division lasts quite a long time, but it's like, yeah, I mean, it just seems to me there's a problem with holding large numbers in the millions and now in the billions together as a unity, right? Without introducing what we now would call a diverse unity, a unity within with diversity. And how do you hold that together? I mean, it's like, yeah, you're not always in the same mind, but I mean, is it just like there's just a flag and we all fall in line and that's the only thing we have in common? How does that work? So I wonder whether, yeah, it's good to think about those times, but we are living in a very different civilization, and we are mostly passive, including myself, the people who clean up the waters, in order to recycle it, the people who do the farming. I don't do none of that, really. I heard about that, but I just go to the supermarket. I drink the water from the tap. It's like that's a pretty passive life. So I could do what I'm gonna do. So I'm liberated to do what I. So how does that work? It's like, yeah, it's good to talk about that, and but that might be very specific to a particular time and place. Even in its criticism. That's maybe the gripe I have. Is like, yeah, but you don't understand how damn complex this and how pervasive capitalism is and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
So yeah. That's my contention with the great Aristotle. So
thanks, Phil. It's a worthy contention. I mean, I'm not a Hellenophile. I'm not one of those who says if only we could all live like the ancient Greeks. I mean, there were all kinds of horrific things about ancient society that I would never want us to go back to. But what's fascinating about this study Kenneth Smith's got us doing in this book is he's, the willingness to discard the past as inadequate comes naturally to a modern. It's right in our name, right? We want to praise ourselves and demonize the past. So it's easy to say, well, of course they weren't perfect. What's a lot harder is to say, and neither are we. And some of the things that we're bad at are things that they were good at.
Yeah.
We can prove that it's possible to do better on a whole range of issues than moderns do because they already did better on those issues. Even though they did worse on other issues, on these particular issues, they did better. And one of them, of course, is that they were far more willing and eager to develop Aristoi, whereas we're committing characterological genocide and trying to eliminate Aristoi because we want our system to exist forever. We don't ever want big pools of money to be disrupted by innovators who come in and say, we should reorganize things. Actually, I've thought of a dramatically better way or more ethical way to do X. But of course, that's going to disrupt the flow of money. So we suppress that. We're obsessed with stability while pretending to be about freedom. So, it's a weird exercise that Kenneth has us doing here, to be digging down into the good qualities of the ancients, because we always have to hold that with one hand and fully get into it and acknowledge it, which is hard for us as moderns. We don't want the ancient Greeks to have been better at anything than us. Not really. We want them to be our primitive forebears, promising but inferior. We don't want them to be better than us at anything. While at the same time, still remembering they kept slaves, they locked up women, and they're in their houses. They were so contentious, they tore their own civilization to pieces. I mean, there are all kinds of problems with the ancient Greeks, but it's fascinating to put them side by side with us and really do the comparison that he's making us do here. So one of them is this, it's not that every Greek did polyvalent writing, but we can make a list of prominent Greeks who did really great polyvalent writing, and we really can't make a similar list of moderns. Moderns extol the virtues of literalism. We want everything to, at least resemble a logical syllogism in some way. It can either be random free expression, look how free I am, yay, I'm free, or it has to be absolutely systematic and logical and proven by facts. And if it's somehow this thing that they do, mythos writing, that's just wrong. We just don't do that, because then, who are you writing for?
Well, to what degree are we trapped in that system, though? In other words, imagine I'm living and I love poetry and all that. Everybody is doing poetry. And I get a piece of furniture from IKEA with an instruction manual, but it's written in poetry.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know how to put it together. It's going to be upside down, sideways. Like,
yeah.
So what trapped with it and thing is like, yeah, I want to be able to put the screw and X and tighten, so I could at least put it together because I don't know anything about that stuff, and at least it gives me a reasonable direct instruction, you know. And
Yeah,
then you
that's
have the screws packed in different bags, so you know screw A is different from screw B, and it's like, so I mean, like this polyvalence kind of thing for putting
it's in the
together
way.
IKEA furniture, it's just
That's
not gonna
right.
work. Well, it'll take a long time, let's put it that way.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, so the point of this bit here is this emphasis on this idea of arete and essentialism that's built into the polyvalence of this statement, which is this idea that we have a duty to be judgmental, but that duty requires the development of taste. And until we develop the taste, we have a duty not to be judgmental because our judgments are terrible. And as finite people, our taste is never going to be good enough, right? We're never going to have like sacred levels of taste where we can hit it on the nose every time and evaluate, judge what's good and what's bad and so forth. But there are still, despite the fact that we can't reach that infinite level, even within the finite range that Homo sapiens occupies, there's an enormous difference between the judgment of a toddler reaching for a hot stove, and a stove engineer trying to engineer things to be safe and hurt as few people as possible. They have different levels of discrimination.
Well, but there's a danger of developing taste. For instance, I have a pretty good taste in art and all the arts and so forth. But for instance, I know when I go to the store and I see wine, I said, God, I wish I had better taste. And I said, no, I don't. I can't afford it. Like I'll just like be depressed every time I'm looking at a wine bottle. So, something like $7.99, that's good enough for me. So you have to also know how to limit your taste in a funny way, salvage it to other things that you care more about. Because if I develop that, it's like, yeah, I'll be in the poorhouse very quickly because I just can't deal with those cheap wine. I have to get, the $2,000 bottle, in order. This, and it would be very pleasurable, I'm sure. But
well, I mean, there was that study in the last year in which they managed to confound a large population of wine specialists who couldn't discriminate the best wine from a lot of mediocre wine. It's sort of like a lot of people can discriminate the really bad wine from mediocre wine. The difference is enormous. But after that, it gets harder to pick out. I was impressed by that.
So was the cutoff point though at $7.99? I mean, like
I can't remember where the cutoff was. Yeah, right. And then after that, well, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. It's hard to say. So, but this idea of that organisms, at least kind of more derived organisms like Homo sapiens, have evolved to the point where we are expected to go through multiple stages of life on our way to the maturation of our full powers. Right? There is like the Greeks said, there is this flourishing period for any given historical figure where they're at the peak of their powers and doing their best work. And that's when they're being most fully human. And before that, they're still just developing into that person. It's like the difference between the cheetah cub and the cheetah. It's like, it's not that we're saying that a cheetah cub is not of the same species. We're just saying you're never going to see what a cheetah is really about until you watch the adult chase down a gazelle and your jaw drops going, holy crap, what am I looking at? This is what a cheetah is about. This is why there are cheetahs. So it's the same with Homo sapiens and the development of the mature adult mind. What an heuristic mind was capable of is something none of us are ever going to see because of the characterological genocide. There aren't any Aristoi left anymore. But we see hints of it in moments of greatness, and we can imagine it by analogy, like when we see incredible acts of sports, We see someone do a high jump that no one's ever been able to do before, and we laugh because we couldn't. Not only can't we do that high jump, we can't even do one half that much. It's like this is way beyond our capabilities. But now that we've seen it, it proves that it's possible. And this goes back to what Donald was saying. It's Kenneth Smith's answer when everyone said, well, what's an Aristos like? He said, well, the way to find out what an Aristos is like is to go find one and hang out with them and follow them around and see what they do. Because you simply wouldn't believe it if I just started narrating to you. It's like the cheetah. The first time you watch a full speed film of a cheetah chase from beginning to end, it's like nothing you've ever seen before. The words cannot do it justice. And it's certainly the same when you see these spectacular acts of people pulling off incredible feats. So the heuristic mind, we know some things about it, partially through description, partially through analogy, partially through leftover products of Aristoi that have survived down to us. But we don't have any examples to follow around, and that's half of the strategy modernity uses to prevent the emergence of any new Aristoi. Donald, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was watching some guy on YouTube the other day. He's a philosopher. And he was talking about a totally different subject. But he made a very Smithian point. At one point, he says, he started by just saying that he would distinguish three types of statements: factual in a very mundane way, that are unobjectionable, evaluative or interpretive, and normative, which render some kind of judgment. And he said, but then he made a point that only really I've heard us make here, or Kenneth, where he says, when it comes to these evaluative or interpretive statements, it really helps if you understand the internal logic of multiple interpretations of a given factual situation from different standpoints. That to understand a factual situation, you may need to see it as the Greeks would have seen it, or as the medieval culture would have seen it, or as moderns see it. And the facility at understanding these any situation in terms of not just seeing it as your opponent does or something like that, but as it might have been seen in different ages by different people in different cultures. And after I picked myself back up after falling out of my chair to hear someone say something like this, it was quite that is one of the motivating factors for all of this work we're doing, to try and be able. I guess we can already misunderstand antiquity in terms of modernity, but we also need to understand modernity in terms of, and it helps. And this guy talked about, he was talking about the war in Ukraine and the Russian viewpoint versus the Ukrainian viewpoint, but he made the same argument that Smith makes, about how this mental facility with being able to think your way in to different views, to really understand their internal logic, improves the quality of your thinking and understanding. And you were just doing a little riff there, so close to that topic. I wanted to leave my mouse alone, but I didn't.
Well, it's part of my goal in life is to lure you off of mute, Donald.
No, but so
yeah,
that's enough.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. So, all right. So where does this all lead? So an implication of that statement by Aristotle is that any of us living sub-political lives, even if we wanted to live a political life and are being prevented from doing so, are basically not operating as adults. We're operating as defective examples of Homo sapiens. And an example of that is, I mean, even in US history, we have this story about the New England towns with the town square where everybody would get together and discuss and debate things and make decisions as a group. And that is obviously a more politically engaged form of politics than once every 4 years collecting a token from going down to a voting booth and checking some boxes and saying, there, I have delivered my opinion for the minimum amount of time, and now I have enough to put on a badge and say, I am not a sub-political animal. I am free. I'm a free functioning adult because I have my token. It's ersatz politics in exactly the way a coin is an ersatz apple. This thing, I can't eat it, and it's not as good as having an apple tree. If I had an apple tree, I could have a lot of apples and I could have them every year, and I'd be more involved in the process of producing my own food, which would make me more adult than if I'm infantilized and have to hope I have enough tokens to go to the market to not starve. And it's the same way if we go down the minimum amount of time, check a few boxes, and then say, there, I am not a slave. I'm not a political slave. I swear, because I checked some boxes every year or two or four, and that makes me free. This is obviously not politics as Aristotle understands it, right? And that's as much as almost everybody in the modern world gets. If you collect together all the people who engage in a greater amount of political involvement than that in the modern world, whether they run for office or they join political action committees or they start initiatives or run relentless letter writing campaigns, you put all those people together, they're a teeny tiny minority of the US population, right? Most of us are slaves, basically. We're slaves without any guarantee of a home, right? And we're slaves in the way the Athenians define slavery, which is you can have every other thing, you just can't have the vote. Right? We have to remember the emperor of Persia coming to Athens, walking around and being frustrated because he couldn't distinguish the free people from the slaves. They all looked the same. They wore the same clothes. They had the same conversations on the street. The difference was one group was denied the vote, and that made them slaves. So in Athens, the vote was this process of deliberation and persuasion, which is why they have the statue of the goddess Peitho above the agora, to remind everybody persuasion is the art. Persuasion is the point. You have to develop your ability to communicate with other people, to see their point of view, and to navigate between your different interests and perspectives. And if you don't have that, you're not a human being. Or at least you're not an adult human being. You're some kind of infantilized version, whether through damage or lack of development. But that's the norm in the modern world. This is part of the modern world's schema for perpetuating itself, is to disenfranchise more or less everybody while convincing them that very act of disenfranchisement itself, the substitution of this token for any real politics, is the proof that they're free and have real politics, right? Just like I've got $1, I could buy anything. It's like, well, not these days, but $100, I could buy anything. Yeah, but you still don't have anything. You just have a piece of paper. You need to actually get engaged if you want to have something. So this would be the ancient world's critique of the United States, that we don't allow the development of adults. Everybody is kept in some form of disenfranchised childish state. And that the number of people who genuinely have politics in the sense that Aristotle meant it in that statement is smaller in the United States as a whole than the number of people who had that status in Athens by itself back in the day. We may be an enormously larger population, but we have significantly less actual political activity. We have things that pass for politics, like, you know, teams, and I hate that team and I love my team, but none of that's politics. And voting, but the way we do voting mostly isn't politics either. And what we call representative politics, which means I may not have a vote, but I voted for that guy over there, and maybe his vote is meaningful, maybe it's not. But, you know, that guy is my token. I call him my representative. And although we've never spoken, somehow he represents me. You know, I mean, it's like the more you tease it apart, the more obvious it is what Aristotle would say about this. All right, so, you know, in this little fragment of text that I wrote and quoted here, I focus on the evil of the individualistic attitude towards politics, which is that groups are evil and the individual is everything. But what I neglected to write here is the opposite is equally bad. The totalitarian perspective, only the group matters, the individual doesn't matter. Both of these alternatives that represent pretty much the entire spectrum of allowed discourse in the modern world in some flavor or another, they're both really childish perspectives compared to the sort of the Greek understanding that there is a polyntropy here. There is a tension between the individual and the group, and that tension is a necessary part of any genuine politics. You can't let either one win. You can't either dissolve into the chaos of a bunch of individuals, nor can you dissolve into the you know, totalitarian regime of the group suppressing all individuals and what they want to do. They're both equally bad. And you don't want to cozy up to either side. You don't want to be mostly, you know, mostly we're a group, but we allow individuals. And you don't want to be mostly we're individuals, but we allow a group. Those are also evil, according to the ancient Greek perspective. In all those cases, they're half-witted strategies to the full complexities of what can only be resolved with polyntropy, the bending back of forces upon each other to harness them, to self-correct against each other and create a living system that Heraclitus writes about. That is the only way to do justice to the conflict. And anything less than that is, it's like a cartoon version of something complicated. It's like, and it's weird that we would even for a moment confuse these sort of half-witted strategies with a full adult solution to these problems. But we do. It's the norm. It's just like if you get people talking about free will and determinism, they'll tell you either you only have free will, or it's all fate and it's all deterministic, or they'll sort of wave their arms around and say it's sort of both in some compromisey, balancy fashion. And all of these things are childish by comparison with the sort of dynamic polyntropy that's captured by ethos anthropoi daimon. It's sort of stunning how underdeveloped, you know, our politics are, our economics are, our understanding of the human mind and so forth. So when Aristotle critiques, I would say us, even though he didn't know he was going to be critiquing us, when he critiques us in the way he does with the sentence, man by nature is a political animal, it feels savage if we really get to the roots of it and understand it the way he meant it, because it's so on point. And it's on point because the problems that afflict the modern era are not modern problems. They're problems that Homo sapiens has had for a long time. And in previous epochs, people used to work to try to overcome those problems. But in our epoch, we work to exploit those problems, to maximize our ability to profit off of each other. The more we can hold down other people's education or intelligence or discrimination, the easier it is to sell them some shitty consumer product or some crappy political party. It's like we make it hard for them to think about things, and then we give them thought-terminating cliches and ideologies so that they can feel like they're participating and like they're free, while the whole time being shackled without quite understanding or being able to put their finger on what's wrong. It's, you know, yeah, the novelties of modernity aren't nearly as novel as we imagine them to be. All right, so so where are we going with this? Well, let's come back to this problem of polyvalence, because that's really what we're talking about. We're saying these are subjects in which there are inherent conflicts. The conflicts have an infinite scale to them. They have an infinite complexity to them. They appear at multiple levels of organization in multiple places at multiple times, uncountably large numbers, so that for all intents and purposes, compared to the ability of a human being to remember 7 plus or minus 2 things at a time, they're effectively infinite. But if we have polyvalency in our language and our concepts, it gives us the potential, the hope at least, to get a firmer grip on a larger area of the problems. But the more our language is stripped down to just little atoms of meaning arranged into little linear sequences that lend themselves to logical syllogisms, the more we lose our capacity to with a few words, capture a large-scale problem and say something that matters to it. This is why I keep harping on this problem of language. Kenneth Smith has talked about this problem of language, but he doesn't harp on it as much as I do, because he made his choice. He decided to not write for most people. He decided to write for himself and anybody who's willing to do the work to follow along. And he'll lay a trail of breadcrumbs, but he's not going to fully explicate what he means. He's going to say, if you don't get it the first time you read my essay, maybe you'll get it the 100th time. Once you've absorbed more of the supporting lessons that make sense of the vocabulary choices. So that's part of what we're doing in this series and why we're spending months unpacking this one paragraph. This is the critical paragraph. Mythos is the logos of the psyche, is every bit as potent a statement as ethos anthropoi daimon. Right? It may not be at the level of gnothi seauton, but it's up there. And it's up there with Fusus cryptus thae philae, nature loves to hide. It's up there with the hidden harmony is best. It's I think, and I haven't told Kenneth this, and I really should. I think it's Heraclitean in its scope and significance. But that only becomes clear when we start to understand how to read him polyvalently. So, yeah, Hegel pulls this off when he says, what is familiar is for that very reason not recognized. He uses bekannt and erkannt in his little rhyming, punning scheme in that sentence. He's describing the relationship between the familiar and what we're able to think about clearly or recognize. So I think everything that I just posted here, this all follows from the things that we've talked about before. So I won't belabor it, but it changes the way we read a sentence like this. So here's the getting closer to the punchline. Let's say, let me drop a little more text in there. Let's say this. So what he's saying is that the ancients understood mythos to be the only form of thinking and culture that can bring the entire human mind to bear on problems. As long as we stay stuck in naive gnosis in the form of the dualic mind, or naive noesis in the form of the monausic mind, we're basically taking a half-witted strategy to trying to understand the problems we face, ourselves, the world, and so forth. And whenever we take a half-witted strategy, the benightedness cast by what we've excluded is so large, the act of nescience is so great that we're basically looking at the world through a funhouse mirror, or worse, with an enormous amount of black felt blacking out parts of what's going on while convincing ourselves we're seeing the whole thing. Only when we pit these two faculties of the mind against each other and harness them into a dynamic polyntropy do we reach the stage where finally they can begin to pick apart each other's deficiencies and reveal what each one was hiding. We're still not going to see everything, but we're at least going to significantly reduce the liabilities of each of these faculties in isolation. And so this is why Kenneth Smith, Hegel, Heraclitus, Aristotle are referring to this as that is the arete of Homo sapiens. And until we achieve that, we're like a cheetah with 4 broken legs. We're not going anywhere. We may be an animal, but we're not genuinely a political animal yet. The reason that it's mythos specifically right? He calls it the mythic mind. The reason it's mythos specifically is that as mortals with a finite understanding, it is not only tempting but inevitable, left to our own devices, for us to underestimate the downside of being finite. That, you know, no one really wants to fully take in the scale of the problem that we face as Homo sapiens. And it's not until you see Sophocles being the best and the brightest that Thebes ever produced. You know, he's the smartest guy, he's the most courageous guy, he seemingly has all the virtues. And in each encounter in his adventure, he does the best he can with those virtues. So this is as good as Thebes has to offer, and that's what produces the worst possible outcome. Until we can see how completely the missing puzzle pieces can create a state of tragic inversion, such that our virtues work against us. You know, little virtues work against us a little, and great virtues work against us a great deal. Until we do that, we don't comprehend what game we're playing. What is life? Life is us being up against this challenge. Well, what's that challenge? Well, it isn't a little thing. As long as we apologize, you know, and rationalize and try to wave off human limitations, we're basically lying about the game of life to ourselves and setting ourselves up for failure. Like someone playing a game of chess while trying to tell themselves it's only checkers. Or someone trying to play Go while telling themselves it's only chess. You know, you have to know what you're actually up against, and that creates the possibility of doing better. That's what this is all about. So going back to his original sentence, when he says the mythic mind discovered the logic of the psychic, that is when that mythos allows us to explain the logos of the psychos, he's talking specifically about this kind of thing. He has to take something invisible, your character, your ethos, the archai at work, your nature, your fundamental nature, and make it visible, which on the one hand is impossible because it's an invisible thing. It's not like an invisible dog, and if you could somehow remove its invisibility, you'd see a dog. This thing doesn't have a shape that is explainable in 3 dimensions. Character isn't that way. But he has to make it visible in a way that not only can you see it for what it is, but its importance is underscored to such an extent that you appreciate why it matters, and it's made unforgettable. So that later, no matter how messed up your life is, no matter how confused you are, you can always return to this lesson and go, oh yeah, there's that thing I should be paying attention to. I really, really, really need to not forget. Right? This is what mythos can do that no logical syllogism can ever do. Because we're talking about unmeasurable things, things that don't have shapes, things that don't have mass, but that determine the outcomes of our stories. So here we get into one of the problems with noetic methods of knowing things, which is that analysis wants to chop things into their pieces and come up with a schema by which it could all just be a machine. And if we just reassemble the pieces the right way, then we get the machine. And if we just turn the crank on the machine, we can see what it does. But all of this is predicated on the beginning point that we actually see a thing. Like we see a redwood tree and say, what makes that tick? Or we see diamond veins in a mine and ask ourselves, what makes that tick? You know, all of this analysis, just like the intellect is predicated upon the unconscious doing most of its work for it, in the same way, you know, the ability to even begin to ask the questions and begin the dissection is predicated upon the idea that we see the thing and recognize that it's something important for us to study. The deck stacked against us when we start talking about something that's invisible, we don't even see it, and it doesn't have a shape, and you can't weigh it or measure its length or its electrical charge. You can cut the brain into as many neurons as you want, and you're never going to find human character because it's a network effect. It's a metaphenomena that's the result of the interactions of enormous numbers of things in concert. It can't be found in isolation. So we need an entirely different approach to understanding these things. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
No, I was just going to say something which is slightly off what we're discussing at the moment, but I'm coming back to this point Nietzsche made. For a long time, I've been searching what's wrong with modern society. And I think Nietzsche seems to have been the one that hit the nail on the head in aphorism 44 of Beyond Good and Evil. He says the problem with his fellow thinkers, his fellow free spirits, his fellow intellectuals, or even his fellow academics, is that they're shallow and superficial. They got all the stuff, got all the institutions, got all the fancy machines, fancy processes, but all that really good stuff seems to have created a weakness of the spirit, a complacency. When you're able to drive to work in the car rather than walking 12 miles, it doesn't promote strength. It makes things ease. Ease does not promote strength. So that's a huge question. And you tell this to modern people. Nietzsche said, you are superficial. You are shallow. You get, they go into meltdown. They get very angry when they get told that they are superficial and shallow. So am I. I see it in myself. They cannot accept that. I was having a bit of an argument and I brought up Jordan Peterson and I discovered there's a new derangement syndrome, Jordan Peterson derangement syndrome. Now, whatever you think of the guy, he's doing his trick. He's having his show. But a lot of people are going into meltdown about him, and I'm trying to figure out why. Or one case they said, oh, he's a misogynist. Well, I don't know. I've never noticed that one, but what's going on here? And the explanation seems to be connected with that point Nietzsche made. Shallowness and superficiality. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, this idea that we have a right not to be criticized, which is a modern idea, right? Is that we have a right to our own, I don't know what to say, senescence. That we don't have any particular duties toward one another. There's nothing that we're really obliged to do. There's no level we're required to lift ourselves up to other than the ability to pay our bills. And as long as we pay our bills, that's fine. That's good enough. It's encouraged by the passivity and infantilization of the modern culture, the way that we structure things. People don't have a lot of agency in their lives. And it leads to sort of a standoff where we say, well, we'll tolerate this, but only if you leave us alone. And that's not a good setup for the kind of striving to improve that's required to develop, heuristic temperament. It's part of why it doesn't happen. So, this thing about how can you convince people to take an interest in the challenges that they're up against in the human condition and what their duties are to try to do better. This is something that whatever else the Greeks got wrong, and they got plenty of things wrong. Yes, in essence, kind of heading in the direction of senility. Kind of the another way of putting it is atrophy from lack of use. Like a cheetah that never runs. It can be well nourished, but if it never runs, it's gonna fall apart. I'm coming off of a year of sitting on my butt writing a proposal, and physically I'm in the worst shape of my life as a result. It's like I'm looking forward to getting out there and walking and doing more Kobudo and karate to rebuild myself, because use it or lose it. So the point is, you see a story in which the greatest heroes of the Greeks destroyed the entire Bronze Age civilization through the exercise of their virtues, and you have a compelling, unforgettable narrative. You make every single Greek child, slave or free, read that and think about it. And you've got the preconditions for a people that understands the limits and liabilities of human nature and the importance of working to push things in a better direction and not let them just slide into entropy. Now, it obviously wasn't enough because they destroyed themselves, but you can see the advantages of an approach like that. And if you compare that to typical US portrayal of history, which is a great march of progress from one victory to another, with an occasional unfortunate moment like the Civil War or the Vietnam War, but most of the time we portray it as how gloriously we rose from our humble beginnings and invented freedom for the first time in the world and rationality. And you think this is a pseudo myth that encourages complacency. It's the exact opposite of what you should be doing if you want people to struggle against the limits and liabilities of the human mind and to work to become a better people and do better in the world, which is why the modern world constructs these things the way that it does, instead of as these great tragic epic warnings that the Greeks trafficked in. So we'll wrap up here for this week, and we'll pick it up again next week. But we've gotten most of the way through this key pivotal sentence, I think, to the point where we can sort of see, what he really means by this. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you all for being here. I hope you had a lovely time. I certainly did. And we'll pick this up again next week. Thanks, everybody.